Mummy, tell us the story. How did you and Daddy meet?
Well, it was a very sunny day.
And your father was wearing a grand crown.
The royal ballroom shimmered beneath thousands of crystal chandeliers, each one reflecting golden light across polished marble floors. A live orchestra played a slow, elegant melody as distinguished guests from around the world filled the magnificent hall. Royal families, Fortune 500 CEOs, diplomats, celebrities, and influential business leaders gathered beneath soaring ceilings decorated with fresh white roses and flowing silk banners. Yet, despite all the wealth and prestige surrounding them, every pair of eyes slowly settled on one couple, Walter and Rose. Standing together at the center of the ballroom, they looked as though the rest of the world had quietly disappeared. Walter couldn't take his eyes off her. Rose noticed. "You've been looking at me all night," she said with a playful smile. Walter grinned. "I've been trying to—" She laughed softly. "Trying? You keep stealing my attention before I can even finish admiring you." A warm blush crept across her cheeks. "You always know exactly what to say." "No," Walter replied, shaking his head gently. "Only when I'm speaking to you." For a few quiet seconds, neither of them spoke again. The orchestra continued playing. Guests smiled among themselves, watching the couple from a respectful distance. Rose lowered her eyes, suddenly feeling shy despite everything they had already shared together. A gentle breeze drifted through the open balcony doors, lifting a loose strand of her hair across her face. Walter slowly raised his hand. His fingertips brushed lightly against her cheek as he tucked the strand behind her ear with extraordinary care. Rose's breath caught. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. Walter stepped just a little closer, until only inches separated them. There was no rush, no audience in their minds, only silence and each other. Rose smiled first. "If I'd known who you really were the day we met." She stopped, letting out a small laugh before looking back into his eyes. "I don't think I would have had the courage to even introduce myself." Walter's smile softened. "No," she shook her head. "I would have been terrified." "Of me?" "No." She reached for his hand. "Of your title." Walter gently intertwined his fingers with hers. "That's exactly why I never told you." Rose searched his face. "You wanted me to believe you were just an ordinary man?" "I wanted you to know Walter before anyone ever introduced a prince." For a brief moment, Rose simply stared at him. There was no crown on his head tonight, no royal announcement, no display of authority. Just the same man who had quietly opened car doors for her, carried heavy boxes without being asked, listened when she needed someone after exhausting board meetings, and smiled whenever she brought him a cup of coffee during late nights at the office. A smile slowly spread across her face. She squeezed his hand a little tighter. "I think I fell in love with that man long before I ever knew the rest." Walter felt his chest tighten. "You did. I really did." He leaned forward until their foreheads gently touched. "I've attended royal banquets. I've met presidents. I've shaken hands with people whose names fill history books." He smiled. "But none of those moments ever made my heart race the way standing here with you does." Rose's eyes glistened. She whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "Then promise me something. Anything. No more secrets." Walter looked into her eyes. His expression changed ever so slightly, almost as though a memory had suddenly returned, a memory he wished he could forget. He opened his mouth to answer. "Well," he began softly, before taking a slow breath, "I wish life were always that simple." Rose frowned. "What do you mean?" Before Walter could answer, a deafening crash echoed from the massive palace doors. The entire ballroom turned toward the entrance. The enormous palace doors slammed against the walls with such force that the music stopped in the middle of a note. Every conversation died instantly. Hundreds of guests turned toward the entrance. A young woman stood there, her chest rising and falling rapidly as though she had sprinted through half the palace to get there. It was Lily Bennet. Her elegant evening gown was slightly dishevelled, and tears shimmered in her eyes. Not gentle tears, but the kind that came from anger, betrayal, and disbelief colliding all at once. Rose blinked. "Lily?" Walter's expression remained calm. Too calm. Lily looked directly at him. For several long seconds she couldn't force the words out. She simply stared. Her lips trembled. Her hands clenched into fists. Finally, "You," her voice cracked. "You lied to us." The sentence echoed across the silent ballroom. Rose frowned immediately. "Lily, what are you talking about?" Lily ignored her completely. She took several determined steps toward Walter until only a few feet separated them. "No," she shook her head. "I don't even know what to call you anymore." Walter didn't move, didn't interrupt, didn't defend himself. Lily laughed bitterly. It was all an act, wasn't it? Rose stepped between them. "Lily, stop. You're upsetting everyone." "No, Rose." Lily's voice echoed through the ballroom. "I'm finally telling the truth." She pointed directly at Walter. "You let us believe you were just our driver." Another step. "You let us believe you were our household assistant." Another. "You sat at our dinner table. You drove us to work. You listened while we trusted you with our lives." Her breathing became uneven. "And all this time," she swallowed hard, "you knew exactly who you were." The ballroom had become so quiet that the ticking of an antique clock could be heard from across the hall. Rose slowly turned toward Walter. Confusion filled her face. What is she talking about? Walter lowered his eyes. His silence only made the questions louder. Rose's heartbeat quickened. "Walter," she moved closer. "Please." His jaw tightened. "Still nothing." Lily stared at him in disbelief. "Say something." Walter remained motionless. "I said." Her voice trembled with emotion. "Say something." Another painful silence settled over the room. Rose searched his face desperately. "Please tell me she's mistaken." Walter looked at her. His eyes were filled with regret, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. Rose's voice became barely more than a whisper. "You promised." She fought to keep her composure. "You promised there would be no more secrets." Walter inhaled slowly. His lips parted. No words came. Rose took one hesitant step backward. It wasn't anger on her face. It was heartbreak. The heartbreaking realization that the man she loved had hidden something so enormous that he couldn't even explain it. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers quietly spread across the ballroom. "Who is he? What is this about? Did he deceive the Bennet family? Was he after their company?" Malcolm Bennet slowly rose from his seat. His expression hardened as old memories rushed back. Every warning he had given Rose, every suspicion, every argument, suddenly returned with terrifying clarity. He looked directly at Walter. "I knew it." Rose immediately turned. "Dad?" "I knew there was something you weren't telling us." Walter finally raised his eyes. For one brief moment, he looked at Rose, not with fear, not with shame, but with the quiet sadness of a man who knew the truth was about to change everything forever. Just as Malcolm opened his mouth to speak again, a deep, commanding voice echoed from the entrance. "His Royal Majesty, the King." The entire ballroom froze. The announcement rolled through the ballroom like thunder. "His Royal Majesty, the King." Every guest instinctively turned toward the towering entrance. Military officers standing along the walls immediately straightened. Royal guards lowered their ceremonial staffs in perfect unison. Foreign ambassadors respectfully stepped aside. Within seconds, every person inside the ballroom was standing. Every person except the Bennet family. Malcolm frowned. Rose looked around in confusion. Lily's breathing became heavier. "What is happening?" Rose whispered. The orchestra, which had fallen silent moments earlier, slowly began playing the royal anthem. A pair of massive gold-trimmed doors opened wider. An elderly gentleman entered first, dressed in an immaculate ceremonial uniform, adorned with medals earned over decades of service. Behind him walked a graceful queen, whose quiet smile carried both dignity and warmth. The entire ballroom bowed. "Your Majesty, Your Majesty, Your Majesty." The greetings echoed from every direction. Malcolm looked from one face to another. His pulse quickened. He had attended meetings with presidents. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions. Yet never in his life had he stood inside a royal palace during a formal reception. His hands suddenly felt cold. Rose slowly looked toward Walter. He hadn't moved. He still stood exactly where Lily had confronted him. His eyes remained lowered, almost as though he had hoped this moment would never arrive. The king stopped walking. Instead of addressing the guests, he smiled. Not at Malcolm, not at the diplomats, not at the executives. His smile was directed at Walter. "My son." Rose blinked. Lily's face drained of colour. Malcolm's brows knitted together. Surely he had heard that wrong. The king walked toward Walter with calm, measured steps. When he finally reached him, he placed one hand proudly on Walter's shoulder. "There you are." Walter finally lifted his eyes. "I'm sorry, father." "There is nothing to apologize for." The king's voice carried through the silent ballroom. "I know this day has not been easy." Rose stared at Walter. Her lips parted slightly. "Father?" The single word escaped before she even realized she had spoken. Walter slowly turned toward her. For the first time since Lily burst into the ballroom, he spoke. "I'm sorry, Rose." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I wanted to tell you." Rose shook her head. "No." She looked from Walter to the king, then to the queen. "No." Her heartbeat pounded so loudly she could barely hear herself think. Malcolm stepped forward. "There must be some misunderstanding." The king looked toward him politely. "There is none. I'm Malcolm Bennett. I know exactly who you are, Mr. Bennett." Malcolm forced a nervous smile. "My employee simply resembles." The king interrupted gently. "He is not your employee." Silence. The words settled over the ballroom with incredible weight. The king continued. "He is His Royal Highness, Crown Prince Walter Alexander." Every face inside the ballroom turned toward Walter. Future king, heir to the throne. The humble driver, the household assistant, the quiet young man who carried groceries, the employee who thanked the kitchen staff every morning. The man Malcolm had accused of chasing the Bennett fortune was one of the wealthiest heirs on earth. Malcolm's knees almost gave way. He remembered every harsh word, every accusation, every suspicious glance, every warning he had given Rose. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Lily slowly covered her lips with trembling fingers. "So," she whispered. "The driver," her voice broke, "was a prince?" Walter closed his eyes for a brief moment. "I never wanted either of you to find out like this." Rose felt tears gathering, despite every attempt to hold them back. "You let me believe," her voice trembled, "that we lived in completely different worlds." Walter looked directly into her eyes. "We did," he swallowed. "I was just hoping, one day, they wouldn't matter." Not a single guest spoke. Not one. Every executive, every royal guest, every diplomat, every member of the Bennett family. They all stood there, watching one simple truth change every life in the room forever. Walter's apology lingered in the air. No one moved. No one even seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Rose searched his face as tears finally escaped down her cheeks. The man she had trusted, the man she had defended, the man she had quietly fallen in love with, had never been the ordinary employee she believed him to be. Yet, strangely, not a single memory of him felt fake. She remembered every early morning when he held the office door open for employees before entering himself. Every time he insisted the security guards eat before he did during company events. Every quiet conversation after difficult board meetings. Every smile. Every act of kindness. Every sacrifice. Those moments had all been real. Only his name had been incomplete. Walter slowly stepped toward her. "I never lied about loving you." Rose looked at him through tear-filled eyes. "I know. I never lied when I said you changed my life. I know. I never lied when I said you made me believe happiness wasn't something money could buy." Rose nodded, unable to speak. Walter lowered his head. "The only thing I hid," he stopped for a brief moment before finishing, "was the life I was born into." Malcolm finally found his voice. "Why?" The question echoed through the ballroom. "You had everything. Wealth, power, respect, a kingdom. Why would you choose to become a servant?" Walter slowly turned toward him. His answer came without anger, without pride, without bitterness. "Because I didn't know if anyone could ever love, Walter." His eyes drifted back toward Rose. "Without first seeing a prince." The ballroom became completely silent once more. Some guests quietly lowered their eyes. Others exchanged thoughtful glances. Even the king remained silent, allowing his son to speak from the heart. Walter continued. "Every relationship I ever had changed the moment people learned my title. They stopped talking to me honestly. They stopped disagreeing with me. They stopped seeing me. They only saw the crown waiting on my head." He looked around the ballroom. "So I crossed an ocean. I accepted a job no prince was ever expected to do. I lived as an ordinary man, because I wanted to know if genuine love still existed." Rose could no longer hold back her tears. Neither could Lily. For the very first time since entering the ballroom, Lily realized Walter hadn't hidden his identity to mock them. He had hidden it because he was afraid of never being loved for simply being himself. And that realization hurt even more. Welcome back to Mr. Austin Love and Story Tales, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. Today's story is one you'll remember long after it ends. It's a journey filled with love, sacrifice, family, unexpected choices, and a secret so enormous it changes every relationship in an instant. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever wondered what happens when two completely different worlds collide? What happens when unimaginable wealth meets genuine humility? What happens when the person everyone overlooks turns out to be the one they never truly understood? And most importantly, could you forgive someone who hid their identity, not to deceive you for personal gain, but because they desperately wanted to know whether your love was real? Take a moment and tell me in the comments. I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts before we continue. And if you enjoy heartfelt romance stories with meaningful life lessons, please help this story reach more viewers by liking this video, subscribing to Mr. Austin Love and Story Tales, and turning on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable journey. Your support truly helps YouTube recommend these stories to more people who love romance, family, and inspiring endings. Now, let's go back to where this extraordinary story truly began. 3 months earlier, morning sunlight poured through the towering windows of Blackwood Palace, stretching across marble floors that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Outside, perfectly trimmed gardens extended farther than the eye could comfortably follow. Fountains sparkled beneath the early light, while palace staff moved quietly through the grounds, preparing another day inside one of Europe's oldest royal residences. For everyone who worked there, this was another ordinary morning. For Walter, it felt exactly like yesterday, and the day before that. A palace attendant opened the carved oak doors to his private suite. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness." Walter looked up from the book resting on his lap. "Good morning, Henry." Henry smiled warmly. "Breakfast has been prepared. Thank you. The King and Queen would also like to see you before today's council meeting. I'll be there shortly." Henry bowed respectfully before leaving. The doors closed once again. Silence returned. Walter slowly looked around the enormous room. Everything anyone could possibly desire surrounded him. Handcrafted furniture, rare artwork collected over generations, a private library, a grand piano, a balcony overlooking the royal gardens. Yet, none of it stirred excitement anymore. Luxury had become routine. Privilege had become ordinary. Even freedom felt scheduled. Walter stood and walked toward the balcony. Far below, visitors had already gathered outside the palace gates. Many held cameras. Some waved small royal flags. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, hoping to catch a glimpse of the future king. Walter smiled politely from a distance. The crowd erupted into cheers. They weren't cheering because they knew him. They were cheering because of who he had been born to be. That realization never became easier. He quietly stepped back inside. Minutes later, he entered the royal dining room. The king looked up from his newspaper. "There you are." Walter smiled. "Sorry I'm late." "You aren't." The queen reached across the table and squeezed her son's hand. "You hardly slept again." Walter gave a small shrug. "I wasn't tired." The king exchanged a brief glance with his wife. Both of them knew that answer wasn't true. It hadn't been true for months. Breakfast continued with discussions about trade agreements, diplomatic visits, charity events, and preparations for an upcoming economic summit. Walter contributed whenever necessary. His education had prepared him well. He understood international finance, constitutional law, foreign policy, negotiation, languages. He answered every question confidently. Yet while everyone else discussed the future of the kingdom, his thoughts drifted somewhere else entirely, towards something much simpler. He wondered what it would feel like to walk into a coffee shop when nobody recognized him, to introduce himself without hearing someone immediately add, "Your Highness," to have one conversation, just one, without titles standing between two people. After breakfast ended, the king stopped him before he reached the doorway. "Walter?" "Yes, father." "You've been distracted." "I'm all right." "You've said that every week." Walter smiled politely. "I really am." The king folded his hands. "Your responsibilities are increasing." "I know. There will come a day when this crown belongs to you." "I know. I need you focused." Walter nodded. "I understand." He truly did understand. That was never the problem. The problem was that everyone around him understood the crown. Very few understood the man expected to wear it. The royal schedule left almost no room for privacy. Meetings followed interviews. Interviews followed ceremonies. Ceremonies followed formal dinners. Every smile was photographed. Every conversation analyzed. Every appearance carefully planned months in advance. Even casual walks through the palace gardens required security teams. Walter accepted those responsibilities. He never complained. He simply wondered whether life offered something beyond duty. Late that afternoon, he attended another charity reception. The ballroom buzzed with conversation as wealthy families, politicians, and influential guests greeted one another. Walter moved gracefully from group to group. He remembered names, asked about families, thanked donors personally. From a distance, he appeared perfectly content. Inside, he felt increasingly alone. A middle-aged businessman laughed while introducing his daughter. "Your Royal Highness, she's admired you for years." The young woman smiled brightly. "It's such an honor." Walter returned the smile. "The pleasure is mine." They spoke for several minutes. She asked about palace life, travel, royal traditions, future responsibilities. Everything sounded pleasant. Everything sounded practiced. Before leaving, her father quietly slipped a business card into Walter's hand. "Our families should stay in touch." Walter looked at the card. It wasn't difficult to understand the real purpose of the conversation. It rarely was. As they walked away, he overheard the businessman speaking softly. If that marriage ever happened, the opportunities would be limitless. Walter looked down at the business card without another thought. He folded it once, then placed it into his jacket pocket. Not because he intended to call, because he no longer had the energy to feel disappointed. Maybe just once. He wished someone would approach him with no hidden expectation. Not because of influence, not because of wealth, not because of a throne. Simply because they wanted to know the man named Walter. Several weeks passed, but nothing changed. Every invitation carried an invisible purpose. Every compliment seemed carefully measured. Every introduction ended exactly the same way. Someone wanted access. Someone wanted influence. Someone wanted proximity to the royal family. Very few wanted Walter himself. One evening the palace hosted another formal gathering. This one was much smaller. Only close political allies, and a handful of distinguished families attended. Walter already knew the reason. His parents had mentioned it several times. Tonight, he would officially meet Lady Isabella Laurent. Their families had known each other for generations. She was intelligent, elegant, highly educated. Everything the royal advisers believed a future queen should be. She greeted him with perfect etiquette. "It's lovely to finally meet you properly." Walter smiled. "You as well." Dinner began pleasantly. They discussed literature, art, travel, languages. At first, Walter found himself enjoying the conversation. For the first time in months, someone actually challenged his opinions, instead of agreeing automatically. He almost relaxed. Almost. After dessert, the orchestra began playing softly while guests drifted toward the ballroom. Lady Isabella walked beside him. "My parents seem very pleased." Walter smiled politely. "I noticed." She hesitated. "So do yours." "They probably are." She stopped walking. "Walter." He turned toward her. "I'd rather be honest." "So would I." She smiled faintly. "I don't think we're speaking to each other tonight." Walter frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I think we're speaking as two people carrying expectations we never created." Walter looked at her for several quiet seconds. She wasn't wrong. She continued. "My father wants a stronger alliance. Your advisors want stability. Our families want history." She let out a slow breath. "But..." Her voice softened. "I don't know who Walter is." The words struck him harder than she realized, because neither did anyone else. Walter gave a small, understanding smile. "And I don't know who Isabella is." They both laughed quietly, not because anything was funny, because they had both reached the same painful truth. After another long silence, Isabella spoke again. "If circumstances were different." Walter nodded. "I know. No hard feelings?" "None." She offered her hand. "Friends?" Walter shook it warmly. "Friends?" Their conversation ended with kindness, respect, mutual understanding. Unfortunately, the people waiting outside the room were not interested in friendship. The king looked hopeful. "So?" Walter answered honestly. "She's a remarkable woman. But we shouldn't marry." Silence. Royal advisers exchanged uneasy glances. His mother studied his face carefully. "Walter, I can't marry someone because everyone expects us to." The king remained composed. "This is larger than personal happiness." "I understand. You've understood since childhood." "I know." "Then why refuse?" Walter met his father's eyes. "Because she deserves someone who chooses her. And I deserve the chance to choose someone too." The room fell completely still. No one challenged him immediately. His words weren't disrespectful. They were simply difficult to answer. Well, perhaps, Walter thought, This would be the first decision in his life that truly belonged to him. The decision would change everything. The palace had never felt quieter. Not because fewer people occupied it. Because Walter had finally made a decision he had spent years trying to avoid. He wasn't rejecting his family. He wasn't rejecting his country. He simply refused to spend the rest of his life wondering whether genuine happiness had ever been possible. 3 days after the meeting with his parents, Walter stood inside the king's private study. Only 3 people were present. The king, the queen, Walter. The room carried none of the grandeur usually associated with the monarchy. No advisors, no guards, no ministers, just a father, a mother, and their son. The king slowly closed the folder lying on his desk. So, he looked directly at Walter. "You've made your decision." Walter nodded. "I have." His mother searched his face. "Tell us." Walter inhaled slowly before speaking. "I need to leave." Silence. The queen frowned gently. "Leave?" "I want to travel." The king folded his hands. "For how long?" "I don't know." "And where, exactly?" Walter hesitated only briefly. "America." The king's eyebrows lifted. "America?" Walter nodded. "I want to live there for a while." His father leaned back in his chair. "As a prince?" Walter quietly shook his head. "No, as Walter." Neither parent interrupted him. "I've spent my entire life being introduced before I even enter a room. Every conversation begins with my title. Every friendship begins with expectations. Every relationship begins with protocol." He looked from his father to his mother. "I don't know what it's like to earn someone's respect. I've only ever inherited it." The queen slowly reached for his hand. "My dear, you don't have to prove anything." Walter smiled sadly. "I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm trying to discover something." "What?" he answered almost immediately. "Myself." The room became still again. The king walked toward one of the large windows overlooking the palace grounds. For nearly a minute, he simply stood there. Finally, he spoke. "When I was your age," Walter looked up, "I wanted exactly the same thing." Walter blinked in surprise. "You did?" The king smiled faintly. "I dreamed about disappearing for a year, working somewhere nobody knew my name, making mistakes, paying bills, standing in line at grocery stores." Walter couldn't help smiling. "What stopped you?" "My father." The king turned around. "He reminded me that someday I would wear this crown. And I stayed." There wasn't bitterness in his voice, only acceptance. The queen looked between both men. "You've never told him that." The king smiled. "I suppose today seemed like the right day." Walter stepped closer. "So, you understand?" "I understand." The king's expression grew more serious. "But understanding isn't the same as agreeing." Walter nodded respectfully. "I know. If something happens to you, I'll be careful. If another country discovers your identity, they won't. You can't promise that." "I can promise I'll do everything possible." The king studied his son for a long moment. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "You've always carried your responsibilities with honor." Walter remained silent. "I won't stand between you and this decision." Relief flooded Walter's face. "But—" the king's voice became firmer. "You leave without royal announcements. No public statements. No official visits. No diplomatic privileges. You'll live exactly as you've requested." Walter smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in months. "Thank you." The queen stood and embraced him tightly. "Promise you'll call." "I promise." "And don't skip meals." Walter laughed softly. "I won't." She held his face between her hands. "I know you're searching for answers." "I am. Just remember, you've always been enough." Walter closed his eyes briefly. Those simple words meant more than any royal ceremony ever had. Preparations began quietly. No newspapers reported his departure. No television broadcasts announced foreign travel. Only a handful of trusted palace officials knew where Walter was going. Even they knew very little. Walter insisted on handling almost everything himself. He packed his own suitcases. He selected ordinary clothing instead of custom-made royal attire. Jeans, simple shirts, comfortable jackets, walking shoes. Nothing expensive enough to attract attention. Nothing recognizable. He even laughed while looking at himself in the mirror. For the first time, he smiled. "I actually look my age." One of the palace attendants entered carrying several expensive watches. "Your Royal Highness, which one would you like to take?" Walter looked at the collection. Each watch was worth more than many families earned in years. He shook his head. "None." The attendant looked confused. "None?" Walter opened a drawer and removed a simple leather-strap watch. "I'll wear this." "But it tells time." The attendant smiled awkwardly. "I suppose it does." Walter chuckled. "I think I'll survive." The palace staff watched him leave the following morning before sunrise. No royal motorcade, no military escort, no press, only one ordinary black sedan waiting outside a side entrance. Henry loaded Walter's luggage into the trunk. "You'll be missed." Walter embraced the older man warmly. "Take care of everyone while I'm gone." Henry smiled. "I've been doing that since before you were born." "I know." The two men laughed together as the car pulled away from the palace. Walter looked back one final time, not with regret, with gratitude. Everything he was had begun there. Everything he hoped to become was waiting somewhere beyond those gates. Nearly 11 hours later, Walter stepped out of the airport into the warm afternoon air. No royal guards greeted him. No photographers waited outside. No crowds gathered. People hurried past him carrying luggage, talking on phones, laughing with family members, rushing to catch taxis. Nobody looked twice at him. Walter smiled. It felt refreshing. He rented a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. The building wasn't luxurious. The walls were plain. The furniture had clearly been used before. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person. Walter stood inside the apartment with his suitcase beside him. "This is home now." His voice echoed softly through the empty room. He couldn't stop smiling. That evening, he decided to cook dinner. How difficult could it possibly be? 45 minutes later, smoke filled the tiny kitchen. Walter coughed while waving a towel beneath the smoke detector. "I've negotiated international trade agreements." He stared at the burnt pasta inside the pot. "And I've just lost a battle against boiling water." He laughed at himself. There was no palace chef waiting to rescue dinner. No staff member rushing in. Only Walter. Eventually, he ordered a pizza. When the delivery driver arrived, Walter opened the door. "Large pepperoni." "That's me." The driver handed him the box. "Enjoy your night." Walter smiled. "Thank you." The young man returned to his car without another word. No bow, no title, no ceremony. Just two ordinary people exchanging a simple conversation. Walter closed the door. He couldn't remember the last time something so small had made him this happy. The following morning, reality arrived. He needed a job. Walter spent hours preparing a resume that omitted everything connected to the royal family. No palace, no monarchy, no royal appointments, no diplomatic experience, only his education and practical skills. He submitted applications everywhere. Hotels, private transportation companies, corporate offices, administrative positions, concierge services. Days turned into weeks. Rejection followed rejection. One interviewer frowned while reading his resume. "You speak 5 languages?" "Yes." "You studied economics, political science, and international relations?" "That's correct." "You've managed large-scale events?" I have. The interviewer looked puzzled. So, he leaned forward. Why are you applying to be an office assistant? Walter smiled politely. I'd simply like an opportunity to work. The interviewer nodded slowly. We'll call you. They never did. Another company questioned why someone with his education wanted an entry-level position. Another assumed his resume was exaggerated. Another believed he was overqualified. Walter left each interview with the same polite smile. America didn't know who he was, but it expected him to prove himself. For the first time in his life, no title could open a door. And strangely enough, Walter welcomed the challenge. 3 more interviews ended exactly the way the others had. We appreciate your time. We'll keep your resume on file. We'll contact you if something suitable becomes available. Walter thanked each interviewer with the same calm smile before walking back onto the busy sidewalk. Nobody called. By the end of the month, he had learned something his royal tutors had never been able to teach him. Finding honest work could be exhausting. One afternoon, while checking new job listings inside a neighborhood cafe, his phone rang. Mr. Walter? Speaking. This is Human Resources from Bennett Global Holdings. Walter straightened in his chair. Yes. We reviewed your application for our executive transportation department. I appreciate that. We'd like to invite you for a second interview. When? Tomorrow morning at 9. I'll be there. The following day, Walter arrived nearly 30 minutes early. Bennett Global Holdings occupied an impressive glass tower overlooking the city's financial district. Employees hurried through the lobby, carrying laptops, coffee cups, and folders as elevators opened and closed without pause. Walter quietly observed everything. Unlike royal palaces, nobody waited for him. Nobody announced his arrival. Everyone appeared focused on earning the next promotion. He admired that. A receptionist smiled politely. Good morning. Good morning. Name, please? Walter? She checked her screen. You're interviewing with Transportation Management. Correct? Take elevator C to the 18th floor. Thank you. The interview panel consisted of 3 managers. Questions came quickly. Tell us about yourself. I enjoy working with people. Any experience driving executives? I've driven individuals with demanding schedules. What would you do if an executive became angry? I'd remain professional. What if they were unfair? My responsibility doesn't change because someone's emotions do. One interviewer looked impressed. You seem unusually composed. Walter smiled. I've learned that staying calm usually solves more problems than raising your voice. The interview continued for another hour. As Walter prepared to leave, the department director walked him to the elevator. You know, Walter looked over. We originally thought you were overqualified. I've heard that before. But after speaking with you, he smiled. I think you might fit exactly where we need someone. 2 days later, Walter received another phone call. We'd like to offer you the position. Walter closed his eyes briefly. For the first time since arriving in America, someone had given him an opportunity based entirely on merit. I gladly accept. His first morning began before sunrise. The transportation supervisor, Michael Carter, handed him several folders. Welcome aboard. Thank you. We handle transportation for senior executives and occasionally members of the Bennett family. Walter listened carefully. Punctuality matters. Absolutely. Confidentiality matters even more. You have my word. Michael nodded. I believe that. Walter quickly became familiar with company routines. Vehicle inspections, maintenance reports, daily schedules, alternative routes, security procedures. He approached every responsibility with complete attention. Within only a week, other employees noticed something unusual. He never complained, never arrived late, never blamed others for mistakes. When another driver struggled to replace a damaged tire before an executive meeting, Walter quietly rolled up his sleeves. "I've got it. You don't have to help. We're on the same team." 10 minutes later, the vehicle was ready. Another afternoon, one of the receptionists accidentally dropped an entire stack of confidential files across the lobby floor. Several employees hurried past without stopping. Walter immediately knelt beside her. "Don't worry. I'm so sorry. No apology needed." Together, they gathered every document before anyone stepped on them. The receptionist smiled gratefully. "Thank you." Walter simply nodded. "It happens." Word spread surprisingly fast. The new driver helped accounting again. He stayed late yesterday. He fixed the conference room projector. He even thanked the cafeteria staff. Nobody had asked him to do those things. They simply reflected who he was. Walter often reminded himself that character should remain the same whether someone was wearing a crown or a company identification badge. By the end of his second week, employees throughout Bennett Global greeted him by name. Not because of status, because of kindness. Monday morning arrived with its usual rush. Executives hurried toward waiting vehicles as assistants checked schedules one final time. Walter stood beside a polished black SUV, reviewing the day's itinerary. Michael approached, carrying a tablet. "Change of assignment." Walter looked up. "You're driving the Bennett sisters today." Walter accepted the tablet. "I understand. They're usually easy to work with." Michael smiled. "They're just very different people." A few minutes later, the building's main entrance opened. Two women stepped outside together. At first glance, they shared similar features. The resemblance was unmistakable. Yet almost everything else about them differed. Rose Bennett walked with quiet confidence. Her navy business suit was elegant without trying to attract attention. She acknowledged employees as she passed. "Good morning." "Morning, Daniel." "How's your daughter feeling, Maria?" "Better, Miss Bennett." "I'm glad to hear it." She remembered names effortlessly. People smiled when she spoke to them because they knew she genuinely cared. Beside her walked Lily Bennett. Her energy filled the entire entrance before she even reached the sidewalk. She laughed while balancing a coffee in one hand and her phone in the other. "You scheduled 3 meetings before lunch?" Rose smiled. "You scheduled none. I believe in optimism. I believe in calendars." Lily laughed again. "That's why you're the responsible sister." As they approached the waiting SUV, Walter stepped forward and opened the rear passenger door. "Good morning." Rose offered a warm smile. "Good morning. Thank you." Lily paused instead of getting inside. She studied Walter for several seconds. Michael hadn't exaggerated. There was something unusual about him. Not his appearance, not his uniform, his posture, the way he carried himself. Relaxed, confident, without the slightest hint of trying to impress anyone. She climbed into the vehicle. Rose followed. Walter closed the door gently before taking his seat behind the wheel. The drive began quietly. Rose reviewed documents for an upcoming board meeting. Lily looked out the window for approximately 20 seconds. Then curiosity won. "So," Walter glanced briefly through the mirror. "Yes, Miss Bennett. You're new." "I am." "Where are you from?" "Europe." "That's a big place." Walter smiled. "It certainly is." Rose lowered her folder, amused. "Lily." "What?" "He's trying to drive." "I'm making conversation." Walter answered politely. "I don't mind." Lily leaned forward slightly. "I knew it." Rose sighed dramatically. "Knew what?" "He's interesting." Rose laughed. "You reached that conclusion in less than a minute." "I trust my instincts." Walter couldn't help smiling to himself. The sisters continued talking for the rest of the journey. Rose discussed quarterly reports. Lily suggested taking a spontaneous vacation. They disagreed, teased each other, laughed. Walter listened quietly. He noticed something immediately. Despite their different personalities, they genuinely enjoyed one another's company. When they arrived at headquarters, Walter stepped out and opened the door once again. Rose gathered her files. "Thank you." "My pleasure." She started toward the entrance before stopping. Turning back, she asked, "Have you had breakfast?" Walter blinked, slightly surprised. "Yes." "Good." She smiled. "Some people skip it when work gets busy." Then she disappeared inside. Lily watched the exchange with raised eyebrows. Interesting. Most people focused on Walter because of how composed he seemed. Rose's first concern had been whether he had eaten. Lily smiled to herself. Well, this new driver had already made an impression, and somehow she had the feeling their lives were about to become far more interesting than any of them expected. Walter's responsibilities gradually expanded beyond driving. Because he was dependable, department managers began requesting him whenever important guests visited Bennett Global. He arrived early, left late, never complained, never sought recognition. Before long, Malcolm Bennett's executive assistant adjusted Walter's schedule. "Mr. Bennett prefers consistency." Walter nodded. "I understand. You'll mainly be assigned to the Bennett family now." "Very well." A few days later, Rose exited the headquarters nearly an hour after sunset. Most office lights had already gone dark. Only a handful of employees remained inside, finishing reports before heading home. Walter was waiting beside the SUV. As soon as he noticed her approaching, he stepped forward and opened the door. "You've had a long day." Rose smiled tiredly. "Was it that obvious?" "You've read the same page 3 times." She looked down at the report still resting in her hands. "You noticed that?" Walter nodded. "You never turned it." Rose laughed quietly before getting inside. "You observe more than most people. It's part of my job." The drive home began peacefully. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Rose finally closed the folder resting on her lap. "I envy you." Walter glanced at the rearview mirror. "Me? You look calm." "I try to be. I don't remember the last time my mind was quiet." Walter considered her words before answering. "Responsibility has a way of following people home." Rose looked out the window. "Exactly. My father built this company from almost nothing. I know how much it means to him. One day, I'll help lead it." "You will." She smiled faintly. "You sound very certain." "I've seen the way employees speak about you." Rose looked surprised. "You have? They respect you. That's different." "How?" "Respect doesn't mean I'm doing enough," Walter answered gently. "People who worry about doing enough usually care the most." Rose didn't reply immediately. Instead, she watched the city lights passing outside. Nobody had ever said that to her. Not her advisors, not executives, not even close family members. It wasn't praise. It was simple observation. And somehow, it carried more comfort than an elaborate speech ever could. Over the following weeks, small routines quietly formed between them. If Rose stayed late at the office, Walter stayed without being asked. If meetings finished early, they drove back without unnecessary conversation. Neither felt uncomfortable with silence. One Tuesday afternoon, Rose stepped into the company courtyard, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Walter had just finished checking the vehicle. She walked toward him. "I wasn't sure whether you liked coffee." Walter smiled. "I do." "Good." She handed him one of the cups. "I guessed. Thank you. You've helped everyone around here. I've noticed people rarely do anything for you." Walter accepted the cup carefully. "That isn't necessary." "I know," she smiled. "I still wanted to." They stood together beneath a row of maple trees overlooking the plaza. Employees hurried past, too busy to notice them. Rose took a sip. "So," Walter looked over, "what did you do before coming here?" It was the question he expected eventually. He had rehearsed his answer many times. I worked for a private family. Long? Several years. You must have travelled. A little. You speak several languages. I had opportunities to learn. Rose nodded thoughtfully. She never pushed further. Walter appreciated that. Most people became curious. Rose became respectful. Another evening, Walter noticed a small framed painting resting beside Rose's office desk while she packed her bag. He paused. You painted that. Rose looked surprised. How did you know? The brushwork. She laughed. That's a very confident answer. I've visited many galleries. She blinked. Really? I enjoy art. Rose looked at him with renewed curiosity. It's just a hobby. I think it's beautiful. She glanced at the painting. I only paint when work becomes overwhelming. What do you paint most? Landscapes. Why landscapes? They're peaceful. Walter smiled. Maybe that's what you're searching for. Rose looked at him for several seconds. You always answer differently than everyone else. Is that a bad thing? No, she smiled warmly. It's actually refreshing. Days became weeks. Neither of them realized how naturally friendship had begun replacing formality. Rose no longer viewed Walter as simply the family driver. She trusted him, not because he offered advice, because he listened. He never interrupted, never judged, never repeated private conversations. One afternoon, Rose found herself laughing at a story Walter shared about accidentally burning pasta during his first week in America. You? She laughed. The man who seems prepared for everything? Walter chuckled. I assure you. He smiled. I was completely defeated by that pot. Rose laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. Employees walking past looked over curiously. It wasn't often they heard one of the Bennett daughters laughing that freely. Walter quietly realized he hadn't laughed this much in years. Not because life had suddenly become easier, because for the first time, in a very long time, his conversations felt genuine. Autumn arrived quietly. The mornings became cooler, the afternoons shorter. Dark clouds gathered more often above the city skyline. One Thursday evening, the final board meeting lasted far longer than anyone expected. By the time employees began leaving headquarters, heavy rain hammered against the building's enormous glass windows. Walter remained in the underground parking area after finishing his duties. Instead of returning immediately to the driver's lounge, he carried a small paperback novel toward a covered seating area near the staff entrance. The sound of rainfall filled the quiet space. He sat down, opened the worn book, and disappeared into its pages. Reading had always grounded him. Inside the palace, inside airplanes, inside hotel rooms. Now, inside a company parking garage, while rain fell outside. Some habits never changed. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Footsteps approached. Walter looked up. Rose stood beneath the awning, holding her shoes in one hand to keep them dry. She had removed her blazer and draped it over her arm. You haven't gone home? Walter closed the book gently. I was waiting for the rain to ease. She smiled. I suppose we're both waiting. Rose noticed the novel resting on his lap. You read after work? I do. She looked genuinely surprised. I wasn't expecting that. Walter smiled. Why not? I don't know. She laughed softly. I guess most people spend evenings watching television. I enjoy books more. Rose glanced toward the rain. So do I. Walter lifted the cover slightly. Have you read this one? She nodded almost immediately. Twice. You liked it. I loved it. Walter smiled. I thought I was the only one. Rose sat down on the opposite bench. Rain continued falling steadily around them. For several peaceful moments, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt easy. Finally, Rose broke it. Can I ask you something? Of course. When you read, She searched for the right words. "What are you looking for?" Walter looked at the rain before answering. "I used to think people read to escape. And now? I think some books help us remember who we really are." Rose lowered her eyes. "I've always felt the opposite." Walter looked at her. "I thought books helped me become someone else." Their eyes met. A quiet understanding settled between them. Walter smiled gently. "Maybe they do both." Rose returned the smile. "Maybe." A cool breeze carried the scent of rain through the open space. Neither of them noticed how much time had passed. Neither noticed that the storm had already begun to fade. They simply remained there, two people from completely different worlds, discovering, without either of them realizing it yet, that home was beginning to feel less like a place and more like the quiet company they had unexpectedly found in each other. Neither of them knew it. But before that rainy season came to an end, their lives would never be the same again. The weeks passed almost unnoticed. Without either Walter or Rose planning it, they began spending more time together than either of them spent with anyone else outside their families. Not because they arranged meetings, because work kept placing them in the same moments. Every morning, Walter arrived before anyone else assigned to the executive fleet. Long before the first board member entered the building, he completed his vehicle inspection, reviewed the day's schedule, and confirmed every destination. He believed preparation was another form of respect. One chilly morning, Rose walked toward the parking area carrying a folder pressed against her side. She looked surprised. "You're already here." Walter smiled. "I usually am. It's barely 7. I enjoy quiet mornings." Rose looked around the nearly empty lot. "I think you're the only person who does." Walter laughed softly. "I doubt that." She returned the smile. "I don't know. Most people are still negotiating with their alarm clocks." Walter opened the passenger door. "I hope yours won." "Barely." She settled into the back seat. "I almost stayed in bed." "I'm glad you didn't." Rose looked up from arranging her documents. "You are?" Walter started the engine. The board meeting would probably miss its presenter. Rose laughed. That was a professional answer. It was, and the personal one. Walter thought for a second. "I enjoy our conversations." Rose looked out the window, hiding the smile that immediately appeared. "So do I." Those conversations slowly became part of their routine. Sometimes they discussed books, sometimes current events. Occasionally they disagreed. Walter welcomed disagreement. Unlike the palace, nobody here agreed with him simply because of who he was. One afternoon they found themselves delayed in heavy traffic after a charity luncheon. Rose sighed while checking the time. "We're not moving." Walter glanced ahead. "Construction. I'll be late." "You've built enough extra time." She looked surprised. "You noticed?" "You always leave 30 minutes early." Rose smiled. "My father says people who arrive on time are already late." "He sounds disciplined." "He is." Walter nodded. "So are you." Rose leaned back. "I wasn't always." "No, I made plenty of mistakes when I first joined the company." Walter looked briefly toward the mirror. "I don't believe that." She laughed. "Oh, believe it. I accidentally approved the wrong shipment once." "What happened?" "My father made me personally call every client." Walter smiled. "That sounds fair." "It was humiliating. It also ensured you'd never repeat the mistake." Rose pointed toward him. "Exactly what my father said." Walter chuckled. "I imagine he's wiser than people realize." She became thoughtful. "He is, but sometimes." She hesitated before continuing. "Being his daughter makes everyone expect perfection." Walter answered quietly. "They expect perfection because they see your position. They rarely think about the pressure behind it." Rose slowly turned toward him. "How do you always understand things like that?" Walter smiled. I've met people carrying responsibilities they never asked for. The answer was truthful, just not complete. A few evenings later, Rose remained inside headquarters reviewing contracts, while nearly everyone else had gone home. Walter waited outside as usual. Nearly 40 minutes passed. Instead of becoming impatient, he walked into the lobby and approached the security desk. "Has Miss Bennet finished?" The guard shook his head. "Still working?" Walter thanked him before visiting the company cafe. When Rose finally exited her office, she found a small paper bag resting beside her laptop. Attached was a handwritten note. "Thought you might have skipped dinner. Please don't." Walter, inside the bag, sat a fresh sandwich, fruit, and bottled water. Rose smiled to herself. Nobody had asked Walter to do that. He had simply noticed. She carried the bag downstairs. Walter stood beside the vehicle. "You bought this? I wasn't certain whether you'd eaten." Rose held up the note. "You remembered. You asked me the same question my first day." Rose laughed. "So this is revenge?" Walter smiled. "No, it's appreciation." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. People passed through the lobby around them, completely unaware that something delicate was quietly growing between two people who still believed they were simply becoming friends. Rose found herself looking forward to ordinary moments more than grand occasions, though she couldn't quite explain why. Unlike Rose, Lily never hid what she was thinking. If something amused her, everyone knew. If something confused her, she asked immediately. And if someone caught her attention, she rarely stayed quiet. Walter had become that person. At first, it had been harmless curiosity. Now, she looked for reasons to speak with him. One Friday afternoon, she spotted him washing the company SUV. She walked over, carrying an iced coffee. "You work too much." Walter looked up. "Good afternoon, Miss Bennet." "There you go again?" "What? Miss Bennet?" Walter smiled. "It is your name. It's also very formal. What would you prefer?" "Lily." Walter hesitated politely. "I'm not sure your father would appreciate that." She laughed. "My father isn't standing here." Walter couldn't argue with that. "Very well." She grinned. "See? That wasn't difficult." "No, it wasn't." She handed him the coffee. "This one's for you." Walter looked genuinely surprised. "You didn't have to." "I know." "Thank you." "You're welcome." She folded her arms. "So," Walter smiled knowingly. "So? I still don't know much about you. I'm afraid there isn't much to tell." "I don't believe that for a second." Walter continued drying the vehicle. "You've travelled." "A little." "You read?" "I do." "You speak several languages." "I've studied." "You fix almost everything." "I try." "You never lose your temper." "I've had practice." Lily narrowed her eyes playfully. "Every answer creates two new questions." Walter laughed. "I hadn't noticed." "Oh, I have." She leaned against the vehicle. "Come to my birthday dinner next month." Walter stopped. "I appreciate the invitation, but I'm not sure that would be appropriate." "Why?" "I'm an employee." "So?" Walter answered gently. "I prefer keeping professional boundaries." Lily pretended to sigh dramatically. "You make everything difficult." "I hope not." "You do." She smiled anyway. "And somehow that makes you even more interesting." Over the next several days, Lily caught herself doing things she had never done before. She checked whether Walter was working before arriving at headquarters. She chose the back seat closest to the driver's side. She found excuses to continue conversations after arriving at destinations. At first, she laughed at herself. This is ridiculous. But the feeling refused to disappear. One afternoon, she walked into Rose's office without knocking. Rose looked up. "Everything all right?" "I need to ask you something." Rose closed her laptop. "Go ahead. What do you think about Walter?" Rose smiled. "He's dependable." "I know. Kind. I know. Very thoughtful. I know. Lily studied her sister carefully. Is that all? Rose frowned slightly. What do you mean? Lily quickly forced a smile. Nothing. She changed the subject almost immediately. But as she left the office, a quiet realization settled inside her. This wasn't simple curiosity anymore. She genuinely liked Walter. The realization didn't excite her as much as she expected. Instead, it made her uneasy, because every time she replayed recent weeks in her mind, she remembered something else. The way Rose smiled after speaking with him. The way Walter naturally looked toward Rose whenever she entered a room. The comfortable silence they shared. Lily stopped walking in the hallway. She let out a slow breath. Well, if her heart was moving in one direction while her sister's heart quietly followed the same path, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would never allow herself to become the reason Rose was hurt, even if it meant quietly stepping aside before anyone realized how deeply her own feelings had begun to grow. By early winter, Walter had become one of the most trusted employees in the Bennett household, not because he demanded attention, because he consistently earned it. If Malcolm Bennett needed transportation, Walter was often assigned. If visiting executives required airport pickup, Walter was usually selected. If an important client requested discretion, Michael almost always called Walter first. His reputation continued growing quietly throughout the company. One Tuesday morning, Bennett Global prepared to welcome executives from 3 international companies for negotiations involving a major renewable energy partnership. Employees hurried through headquarters. Conference rooms were being rearranged. Presentation screens were tested repeatedly. Assistants checked schedules one final time. Rose reviewed financial projections with her team, while Malcolm met privately with department heads. Walter waited near the executive entrance after dropping off one of the visiting guests. As he returned toward the lobby, raised voices caught his attention. Inside the main conference room, tension was growing. The translator hasn't arrived. What do you mean he hasn't arrived? His flight was delayed. We begin in 15 minutes. We can't postpone this meeting. Walter continued walking. The conversation wasn't his responsibility, or so he believed. Just as he reached the hallway, Michael hurried toward him. Walter turned. Yes? Michael looked exhausted. Can I ask you something? Of course. You mentioned during orientation that you speak French. I do. And German? Yes. Michael hesitated. Our interpreter is stuck at the airport. Walter immediately understood the problem. The guests? They're more comfortable negotiating in their native languages. Michael rubbed his forehead. If we don't communicate clearly today. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Walter remained thoughtful. If it helps? Michael looked up. I can assist until your interpreter arrives. You'll do that? If Mr. Bennett approves. Michael disappeared almost immediately. Less than 3 minutes later, Malcolm himself entered the hallway. He studied Walter carefully. Michael tells me you speak several languages. I do. Comfortably? Yes. Malcolm crossed his arms. French. Walter answered in fluent French, without hesitation, without searching for words. Malcolm blinked. German? Walter switched languages just as naturally. The nearby executive assistant looked genuinely stunned. Malcolm remained silent for several seconds. Finally, come with me. The meeting began exactly on schedule. Walter remained near the side of the conference room. He translated questions, clarified technical terminology, ensured every participant fully understood each proposal before discussions continued. He never interrupted, never inserted personal opinions, only translated with remarkable precision. Several visiting executives exchanged impressed glances. One French executive smiled warmly. Your interpreter understands business remarkably well. Walter translated the compliment before answering politely. Thank you. Negotiations continued for almost 2 hours. Near the end of the meeting, a disagreement emerged regarding long-term production costs. Both sides struggled to explain their concerns clearly. Walter listened quietly. Then he respectfully addressed Malcolm. "Sir?" Malcolm looked toward him. "Yes? I may have noticed where the misunderstanding began." The room became quiet. Malcolm hesitated. "Go on." Walter stepped toward the presentation screen. He pointed toward one section of the financial report. "The figures themselves aren't the issue." Everyone listened carefully. "The two companies calculate projected maintenance costs using different reporting periods." He looked toward the visiting delegation. They're discussing annual operating expenses. He then looked back at Bennett Global's finance team. "You're presenting 5-year averages." Realization spread across both sides almost simultaneously. One executive quickly checked his documents. "He's right." Another nodded. "We've been comparing completely different models." Within minutes, the disagreement disappeared. Negotiations resumed smoothly. When the meeting concluded, both companies agreed to continue the partnership. As guests left the conference room, one senior executive quietly approached Malcolm. "You've hired exceptional people." Malcolm glanced toward Walter. "I'll admit," his voice remained thoughtful, "he exceeded my expectations today." Across the room, Walter simply returned to collecting empty water glasses, as though none of it had been extraordinary. Perhaps the greatest measure of wisdom wasn't proving how much someone knew. It was knowing exactly when to speak. The successful meeting became a popular topic throughout headquarters. Employees congratulated one another. Several managers praised the finance department. Others complimented Michael's transportation team. Walter accepted every compliment with the same modest smile. "I only helped. Nothing more, nothing less." Later that afternoon, Malcolm sat inside his office, reviewing reports from the meeting. Rose entered carrying several signed agreements. "Everything's finalized." Malcolm nodded. "Excellent." She noticed his thoughtful expression. "What is it?" Malcolm closed the folder. "This driver." "Walter?" "Yes." Rose smiled. "What about him?" "He speaks at least 3 languages." "I've heard more than that." "He understands international finance." Rose nodded. "He seems well educated." "He corrected a problem that experienced executives missed." Rose placed the documents on Malcolm's desk. "Some people are simply talented." Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared through the office window overlooking the city. Finally, he spoke. "Where did we find him?" "Transportation hired him." "Background check?" "I assume human resources completed one." Malcolm pressed a button on his desk phone. "Linda?" "Yes, Mr. Bennett." "Send me Walter's employment file." "Right away." Rose looked puzzled. "Dad." He met her eyes. "Doesn't anything about him strike you as unusual?" She smiled. "Actually." "What?" "I think it's refreshing." Malcolm frowned slightly. "Refreshing?" "He never boasts. He never reminds people what he knows. He helps because he wants to." Malcolm leaned back. "Maybe." Rose laughed softly. "You sound suspicious." "I'm careful." "There's a difference." Malcolm remained unconvinced. An hour later, Walter's employment file arrived. Malcolm reviewed every page carefully. Education, references, previous employment, language certifications, driving qualifications. Everything appeared legitimate, yet something refused to settle in his mind. He called Michael. "Come in." Michael entered moments later. "You wanted to see me?" Malcolm held up the file. "This young man." "Walter? How long have you supervised him?" "Almost 4 months." "Any problems?" "None." "Complaints?" "Never." Michael smiled. "If anything, employees request him." Malcolm nodded slowly. Has he ever talked about his family? No. Friends? Very little. Relationships? Michael shook his head. He keeps his private life private. Malcolm tapped the folder thoughtfully. I've built companies by noticing details other people overlook. I know. And something about him doesn't fit. Michael looked surprised. What exactly? Malcolm answered honestly. I haven't figured that out yet. That evening, Rose found Walter waiting beside the vehicle after another long workday. She noticed he seemed unusually quiet. Everything all right? Walter smiled. Of course. You don't seem convinced. Walter hesitated briefly before answering. Mr. Bennett asked several questions today. Rose looked curious. My father? Yes. What kind of questions? Mostly about my background. Rose smiled reassuringly. He probably just wanted to thank you after today's meeting. Walter returned the smile. I hope you're right. Rose looked at him confidently. I know my father. He may seem intimidating, but he's fair. Walter opened the passenger door for her. I'd like to believe that. Rose stepped inside without the slightest doubt crossing her mind. She trusted Walter completely. Malcolm, however, had begun seeing pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. The questions forming in his mind were still small, still incomplete, but each passing day gave them a little more weight, and before long, those unanswered questions would become impossible for him to ignore. The questions Malcolm Bennett carried home that evening refused to leave him alone. Over 4 decades in business, he had trusted one instinct above every spreadsheet, contract, and financial forecast. When something didn't add up, he investigated. Walter's employment file sat open across his desk long after everyone else had left headquarters. Every page looked legitimate. Every reference checked out. His driving qualifications were authentic. His educational background was impressive. His previous employment listed a private European household that no longer appeared to exist. That was the first detail Malcolm couldn't ignore. He picked up the phone. Rebecca, his executive assistant, answered immediately. Yes, Mr. Bennett? I need the contact information for Mercer Investigations. I'll send it now. Thank you. Within the hour, Malcolm sat across from David Mercer, a private investigator whose firm had quietly assisted Bennett Global during corporate fraud cases for years. David opened a notebook. What do you need? Malcolm slid Walter's file across the table. I want to know who this man really is. David skimmed the documents. He works for you. Yes. Has he committed a crime? Not that I'm aware of. Threatened anyone? No. David looked up. Then why investigate him? Malcolm leaned back. Because nothing about his life matches the way he carries himself. David waited. He speaks multiple languages fluently. He understands international negotiations. He has remarkable self-control. He solves problems experienced executives struggle with. Malcolm tapped the file. And yet, he applied to become a driver. David nodded slowly. You think he's hiding something? I think everyone has a reason for becoming who they are. What if he's simply private? Malcolm answered calmly. I'll gladly accept that answer. If it's true. David closed the folder. I'll begin tomorrow. The investigation moved faster than either man expected. Within 48 hours, David had spoken with former employers. Everything checked out. Walter had indeed worked for a private European family. His references praised him. He was dependable, respectful, exceptionally educated, always professional. Nothing unusual. David expanded the search. University records, employment history, financial activity, travel records. Again, everything appeared legitimate. Yet every search reached the same invisible wall. The household Walter previously served had almost no public information. Ownership records were protected. Property details had been restricted. Even archived photographs had quietly disappeared from ordinary databases. David frowned. That almost never happened. He contacted another investigator specializing in European records. 2 days later, she returned his call. "I've never seen anything like this. What did you find?" "Almost nothing." "Nothing? The records exist. But every attempt to access the family behind them redirects through diplomatic protection." David straightened. "Diplomatic?" "Exactly. Private families don't receive that level of protection." "No, they don't." David remained silent. His colleague continued. "Whatever family employed Walter, they're connected to governments at the highest level. Or," she paused, "they are the government." The line went quiet. David slowly lowered his phone. This investigation had become something entirely different. 3 days later, Malcolm welcomed David back into his office. "Tell me." David placed a thin folder on the desk. "I've confirmed every document Walter submitted." Malcolm frowned. "That's good." "It is. But I couldn't go any further." Malcolm looked surprised. "You?" David nodded. "Every meaningful trail disappears behind diplomatic restrictions." Malcolm leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "I honestly don't know." "Intelligence?" "Possibly." "Government?" "Maybe former military." "I can't rule it out." David looked Malcolm directly in the eyes. "I've investigated senators, foreign executives, billionaires. I've never encountered records protected this thoroughly." Malcolm stared at Walter's file. For the first time, he wondered whether his employee was hiding something far larger than a difficult childhood. The absence of answers sometimes raised more questions than the answers themselves ever could. While Malcolm searched for facts, Walter remained completely unaware. His days continued much as they always had. Morning pickups, executive schedules, airport transfers, late night returns. The only noticeable difference was how naturally Rose had become part of his routine. She no longer waited inside the lobby when meetings ended. Instead, she often walked outside a few minutes early, not because she was impatient, because she enjoyed those brief conversations before the drive home. One evening, the sunset painted the skyline in warm shades of gold and amber. Rose stepped into the parking area carrying 2 paper cups. "I brought tea," Walter smiled. "I was just thinking about making some." "I guessed." She handed him one. "I remembered you don't always drink coffee." Walter accepted it gratefully. "You remember a lot. So do you." They stood beside the vehicle instead of leaving immediately. For once, neither seemed in a hurry. Rose took a careful sip. "Can I ask you something?" "You always can." She hesitated before speaking. "Have you ever been disappointed by someone you trusted?" Walter looked toward the fading sunset. More faces came to mind than he cared to remember. Royal advisers, friends, former fiancés. People who changed the moment they learned his future. He answered honestly. "Yes." Rose nodded slowly. "I have too." "What happened?" She smiled faintly. "Nothing dramatic. Sometimes people become close because of your last name. They assume opportunities come with friendship." Walter listened without interrupting. "When I was younger," Rose looked down at the cup, warming her hands. "I thought everyone liked me." "What changed?" "I started noticing how quickly some people disappeared whenever they couldn't gain anything." Walter understood that feeling better than she could possibly imagine. "They weren't looking for you." "No, they were looking for access." Rose looked at him. "You understand that surprisingly well." Walter smiled gently. "I think everyone hopes to be valued for who they are, not what they represent." Rose's expression softened. "Exactly." For several quiet moments, they simply watched traffic move beyond the company gates. The city continued its busy rhythm. Car horns echoed in the distance. Office lights flickered on across neighboring buildings. Walter finally spoke. "What do you fear most?" Rose laughed softly. "That's a serious question." "It is," she thought carefully. "Losing the people I love. Failing my father. Making decisions I can't undo." She looked back at him. "What about you?" Walter answered without hesitation. "Living an entire life." He paused briefly before finishing. "Without ever knowing whether someone truly saw me." Rose searched his face. There was something deeply personal hidden inside that sentence. She could feel it. Yet she chose not to press further. Instead, she reached over and gently touched his arm. "You know something?" Walter looked at her. "I think anyone who really pays attention," she smiled warmly, "would be very lucky to know you." Walter didn't answer immediately. Not because he lacked words, because none of them seemed sufficient. Well, perhaps some connections didn't begin with dramatic declarations at all. Perhaps they began with simple conversations, shared honesty, and the comforting realization that someone was finally listening without expecting anything in return. Winter settled over the city with crisp mornings and early sunsets. By now, Walter had become such a familiar presence around the Bennett household that most employees hardly noticed him anymore. He quietly completed his responsibilities. He greeted everyone by name. He helped wherever he was needed. Then he disappeared into the background again. To Walter, that was exactly how he wanted it. Invisible, ordinary, free from questions. Unfortunately, life rarely honored carefully made plans. It happened on a Wednesday evening. Malcolm had traveled across town for a charity dinner, while Rose remained at headquarters preparing for an important presentation scheduled for the following morning. Lily, on the other hand, had finished work unusually early. She decided to stop by the company garage before heading home. "I'll surprise Rose," she said to herself. "Maybe convince her to leave work before midnight for once." As she entered the executive parking level, she noticed Walter standing alone near a quiet corner outside the maintenance office. His back was turned. A phone rested against his ear. Lily smiled. "There you are." She started walking toward him. Then she heard him speaking. Not English. The words flowed effortlessly, in a language she didn't recognize. His tone immediately caught her attention. It wasn't the language itself. It was the respect in his voice, almost ceremonial. She slowed her pace without realizing it. Walter continued. "No, please tell His Majesty everything is under control." Lily froze. "His Majesty?" She frowned. Maybe she had misunderstood. Walter listened for several seconds before answering again. "No, there is no reason for concern. I've settled into my work." Another pause. "I understand the Queen's worries." His expression softened. "Please tell Her Majesty I'm well." Lily's heart skipped. "Her Majesty?" She remained hidden behind one of the concrete support columns, completely unnoticed. Walter's voice lowered. "I know Father's schedule is demanding. I wish I could attend." Another brief silence. "No, I can't return yet. Not until I finish what I came here to do." Lily's breathing became shallow. Every sentence only deepened the mystery. Who was this man speaking to? Why did he mention a king? A queen? His father? She couldn't understand the language itself, but every few sentences Walter naturally slipped into English while responding. The titles alone were impossible to ignore. Walter smiled faintly. "No, I still haven't told anyone. They know me only as Walter." Another pause. "I'd like to keep it that way." He listened quietly, before answering one final time. "Please thank Henry for me. I miss all of you. I'll call again soon." The conversation ended. Walter slipped the phone into his pocket and remained standing for a moment, looking toward the evening sky. His expression carried both peace and longing. Lily stepped back instinctively before he turned around. She waited until he walked toward the garage exit, before allowing herself to breathe normally again. What, she whispered to herself, was that? The drive home felt unusually quiet. Lily barely noticed the music playing through the car speakers. Her thoughts kept returning to the conversation. His Majesty, Her Majesty, Father, Henry. It sounded impossible, ridiculous. Yet Walter hadn't sounded like someone pretending. He had spoken naturally, comfortably, almost as though those titles belonged in everyday conversation. By the time she reached home, curiosity had completely replaced amusement. She carried her laptop into her bedroom. Let's see who you really are. She searched every combination she could think of. Walter, European driver, multiple languages, private household, former employer. Nothing. She searched employment databases, professional networking sites, archived photographs. Nothing meaningful appeared. She leaned back in her chair. That's strange. Most people left traces online. School photographs, old interviews, social media, friends, family celebrations. Walter seemed to have almost no digital footprint. The little information she found simply repeated what Bennett Global already knew. It wasn't enough. Not even close. The following afternoon, Lily visited Human Resources under the excuse of reviewing transportation schedules for an upcoming charity gala. During the conversation, she casually asked, "Our new driver, Walter?" The manager smiled. "He's become popular." "I can see why." She pretended to flip through several papers. "Where exactly did he work before joining us?" The manager opened a digital file. "It says he worked for a private European family." "Which family?" "I'm afraid that's confidential." "Oh," Lily smiled politely. "I was only curious." She thanked the manager and left. The answer bothered her even more. Everything about Walter seemed carefully protected, not fabricated. Protected. There was a difference, and she intended to discover it. The more answers slipped through her fingers, the more convinced she became that Walter wasn't hiding an ordinary past. He was protecting an extraordinary one. A week later, Malcolm Bennett made a decision. He no longer wanted reports. He wanted answers directly from Walter. Late Friday afternoon, he asked his executive assistant to send Walter to his office after the final meeting ended. Walter knocked softly. "You wanted to see me, sir. Come in." Walter entered and quietly closed the door. Malcolm remained standing beside the large windows overlooking the city. For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Malcolm turned around. "How are you settling in?" "Very well." "You enjoy working here?" "I do." "You've impressed a great many people." "I'm grateful for the opportunity." Malcolm nodded slowly. "So I've heard." He walked toward his desk. "I've also learned you speak several languages." "Yes." "You understand international finance?" "I've studied." "You carry yourself with unusual confidence." Walter smiled politely. "I simply try to do my job well." Malcolm stopped a few feet away. "No, I think there's more to it than that." Walter remained calm. "What do you mean?" "I've spent months observing you. You never exaggerate. You never lose control. You understand boardroom negotiations. You seem equally comfortable speaking with janitors and executives." Malcolm folded his arms. "That combination is rare," Walter answered honestly. "I've been fortunate to learn from many different people." Malcolm's gaze hardened. "And exactly who were those people?" Walter hesitated. "My previous employers." "Who were they?" "I'm afraid I can't discuss them." "Why not?" "I gave my word." The answer only deepened Malcolm's suspicion. "You gave your word. To whom?" Walter stayed silent. Malcolm took another step. "I hired investigators." Walter's expression remained composed, though his heartbeat quickened. "They found almost nothing." "I'm not surprised." "No?" My employers valued privacy. Malcolm laughed once, without humor. Privacy? He shook his head. Privacy doesn't explain diplomatic protection. Walter looked up. For the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. Malcolm noticed it immediately. So, there is something. Walter spoke carefully. My past has nothing to do with my responsibilities here. It has everything to do with my daughter. Walter frowned. Rose? Yes. Malcolm's voice became firmer. I've watched the two of you grow closer. We're friends. Friends become something else. Walter didn't answer. Malcolm continued. I've seen this before. Men find successful women. They earn trust. They become indispensable. And eventually, they reach for the fortune. Walter stared at him in disbelief. I would never do that. Then tell me who you really are. I can't or won't. Walter lowered his eyes. I made a promise. Malcolm's patience finally broke. Enough. His voice echoed through the office. I don't care how educated you are. I don't care how many languages you speak. I don't care who protected your records. He pointed toward the door. The only conclusion that makes sense. He paused, looking Walter directly in the eyes. Is that you've deliberately manipulated your way into my family's life. Walter stood perfectly still. The accusation landed harder than any insult he had ever received. Not because it questioned his character, because it questioned the very reason he had crossed an ocean to find genuine human connection. And now, the one thing he had worked hardest to protect was being mistaken for deception. Walter remained standing exactly where Malcolm had left him. The office door closed with a quiet click. For several seconds, neither man moved. Malcolm's breathing was steady, but the frustration in his eyes hadn't faded. Walter lowered his gaze, not because he felt guilty, because he understood that no explanation he could offer would be enough. Malcolm broke the silence. Well? Walter looked up. You've accused me of something I would never do. Then defend yourself. I can't. Malcolm repeated the word with disbelief. Or won't, Walter answered calmly. I gave my word. Two people I promised to protect. Malcolm shook his head. So, you're choosing strangers over my family? No, I'm choosing integrity. The answer only fueled Malcolm's anger. Integrity? You expect me to believe that? Walter spoke with the same measured tone he had used since the day he arrived at Bennett Global. If I betray someone's trust today... He paused briefly before continuing. How could anyone ever trust me tomorrow? Malcolm laughed once. It wasn't amusement. It was frustration. You're good? I've met men like you before. They sound reasonable. They earn sympathy. They hide behind carefully chosen words. Walter remained silent. Malcolm stepped closer. My daughter believes in you. Walter's expression softened. I know. Lily respects you. I know. My employees admire you. I've been fortunate. Malcolm's voice grew firmer. And you've allowed all of it. Walter met his eyes. I never asked for anyone's admiration. No, you simply made sure to deserve it. Walter didn't deny that, because it was true. Everything he had done had come from genuine respect. Nothing more, nothing less. Malcolm studied him for another long moment. You know what troubles me most? Walter waited. If you were chasing money, I'd understand it. If you wanted influence, I'd understand that too. But you, he pointed toward Walter, make no sense. Walter gave a faint smile. Perhaps that's because your conclusion is wrong. Then give me the right one. I can't. The room fell silent again. Walter knew the truth. One sentence, one name, one title. That was all it would take to end every accusation. but it would also destroy the very thing he had crossed an ocean to discover. If Rose looked at him differently, because she learned he was a prince, he would never know whether her kindness had truly belonged to Walter, or to the crown waiting for him overseas. That uncertainty frightened him more than Malcolm's anger ever could. Malcolm slowly walked back toward his desk. "I've spent my life protecting this family. I believe that. I won't apologize for doing it again." Walter nodded respectfully. "I wouldn't ask you to." Those words surprised Malcolm. "You still respect me?" Walter answered honestly. "You're trying to protect your daughter. If our positions were reversed—" He allowed himself a small smile. "I'd probably ask difficult questions too." For the first time since the conversation began, Malcolm hesitated. Walter wasn't arguing. He wasn't becoming defensive. He wasn't trying to escape responsibility. He simply refused to betray a promise. That made him even harder to understand. Malcolm found himself wondering whether he had misjudged the young man. Yet every instinct still urged him to be cautious. Walter quietly bowed his head. "I appreciate the opportunity you gave me. I've learned a great deal here." Without waiting for another accusation, he turned toward the door. Just as his hand reached the handle, "One more thing." Walter stopped. "If I discover you've hurt my daughter," Malcolm's voice remained calm, "I'll do everything in my power to remove you from her life." Walter looked back. "You won't have to." Then he walked out. News traveled quickly inside Bennett Global. Nobody knew exactly what had happened inside Malcolm's office, but employees noticed something had changed. Walter spoke even less than usual. Malcolm remained unusually quiet during meetings. Rose sensed the tension almost immediately. Late that afternoon, she entered her father's office carrying revised contracts. He wasn't reading them. He was staring through the window. "Dad?" Malcolm turned. "There you are. You wanted these signed." She placed the folder on his desk. Instead of reaching for it, Malcolm asked, "How close are you to Walter?" Rose looked surprised. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one. He's my friend." "Only your friend?" Rose frowned. "Why does that matter?" Malcolm folded his hands. "Because I don't trust him." The words landed heavily. Rose stared at him. "You don't?" "No." "Why?" "I've told you. His story doesn't make sense." Rose shook her head. "Not making sense isn't a crime." "I never said it was." "You hired investigators." Malcolm didn't answer. Rose's eyes widened. "You actually did?" "Yes." "You investigated someone who has done nothing but help this family." "I'm protecting you." "From what?" "A man whose past nobody can verify." Rose's voice rose for the first time. "You've verified enough to employ him. Employment is different." "No, it isn't." Malcolm stood. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me." "I've watched intelligent people lose everything because they trusted the wrong person." Rose stepped closer. "And I've watched good people get hurt because nobody trusted them." Neither spoke. The office suddenly felt much smaller. Rose took a slow breath. "Walter has never asked me for money. He has never asked for favors. He has never used our family name. He has never crossed a single professional boundary." She looked directly at her father. "So tell me, what exactly has he done wrong?" Malcolm couldn't answer immediately. Finally he said, "I believe he's hiding something." Rose nodded. "Maybe he is. But everyone has parts of their life they're not ready to share. That doesn't automatically make them dangerous." Before Malcolm could respond, another voice came from the doorway. "I think she's right." Both turned. Lily stood there. Neither of them had realized she had arrived. Malcolm looked at his younger daughter. "You've been listening." "I heard enough." She walked inside slowly. "I don't know what Walter is hiding." She stopped beside Rose. But I do know this. I've never once felt unsafe around him. Malcolm sighed. You're both letting emotion guide you. Lily exchanged a brief glance with Rose. No, Rose answered quietly. We're letting his actions guide us. The room became silent. Lily's heart felt heavier than either of them realized. She still hadn't told anyone about the mysterious phone call. She still couldn't explain the titles she had overheard. Questions continued filling her mind. Yet, despite all those unanswered questions, she couldn't convince herself Walter was a dishonest man. She looked at her father. I want the truth too. Her voice softened. But I don't want us to destroy someone before we know it. Well, she thought silently. If Walter truly was hiding an extraordinary secret, she prayed it wasn't one that would cost everyone she cared about the happiness they had only just begun to find. The following Monday began like every other. Employees arrived, carrying coffee. Elevators filled with conversations about deadlines and meetings. Phones rang across every department. On the surface, nothing had changed. Yet Walter knew everything had. Malcolm no longer assigned him directly to family transportation. Most instructions came through Michael. Rose noticed. She tried speaking with Walter several times, but every conversation was interrupted by work. He wasn't avoiding her out of indifference. He was protecting the one thing that still mattered. If he stayed, the conflict inside the Bennett family would only grow. Late that afternoon, Walter sat alone inside the small employee lounge. A blank sheet of paper rested in front of him. He picked up a pen, set it down again, tried once more. Nothing came. He had delivered speeches before diplomats, negotiated difficult conversations, represented a royal family with confidence. Yet writing a single letter to one woman felt impossible. After several quiet minutes, he finally began. Rose, I started this letter more times than I can count. Every version sounded too formal, too distant, too unfinished. So I'll simply tell you the truth. He paused, closed his eyes briefly, then continued writing. Thank you. Not because you trusted me, not because you defended me, but because you reminded me that kindness still exists without expecting anything in return. Long before you knew anything about my past, you asked whether I had eaten. You remembered how I took my tea. You noticed when I looked tired. You treated every employee with the same respect you showed executives. I watched those small moments more carefully than you ever realized. Walter stopped again. A faint smile crossed his face as memories returned. The rainy evening, the conversations during traffic, the coffee beneath the maple trees, the laughter after his disastrous attempt to cook pasta. Each memory found its place inside the letter. Somewhere along the way, I stopped looking forward to finishing work. I started looking forward to our conversations. They became the quietest part of my day, and perhaps the happiest. His hand remained still for several seconds. One final paragraph remained, the most difficult one. I can't explain everything today. One day, perhaps, life will allow me to. Until then, please don't let my leaving convince you that your kindness was misplaced. It changed someone more than you'll ever know. I hope you meet a man worthy of the heart you've protected so carefully. Thank you for helping me believe that genuine goodness still exists. Walter, he folded the letter carefully. No royal seal, no signature revealing who he truly was, only his first name, exactly as Rose had always known him. Before leaving headquarters that evening, Walter quietly walked toward the executive library. During one of their many conversations, Rose had once mentioned that whenever life became overwhelming, she returned to the same novel. Its pages had become familiar through years of rereading. Walter remembered exactly where she kept it. He removed the book gently from the shelf, opened it halfway, placed the folded letter between its pages, then returned it exactly as he had found it. No one saw him. No one stopped him. As he turned away, he looked around the quiet room one last time. The reading chairs, the fireplace, The shelves they had talked about countless times. Every corner carried a memory. Walter smiled sadly. "Goodbye, Rose." Not another word escaped his lips. He quietly walked out of the room. Some goodbyes arrived without raised voices or dramatic farewells. They simply settled into the heart, waiting to be understood long after someone had already gone. Before sunrise the next morning, Walter returned to Bennett Global one final time. The parking garage was almost empty. Michael happened to arrive early and looked surprised to see him carrying a small travel bag. Morning. Michael noticed the bag immediately. "Going somewhere?" Walter smiled gently. "I'm resigning." Michael stared at him. "What?" "I've already submitted everything to Human Resources." "When did you decide this?" "Last night." Michael shook his head slowly. "This doesn't feel right." "I know. You've become part of this place." Walter extended his hand. "I'm grateful for every opportunity." Michael ignored the handshake. Instead, he pulled Walter into a brief embrace. "You'll be missed. So will all of you." After thanking the transportation team individually, Walter quietly left the building through the same entrance he had used on his very first day. No announcement followed him. No farewell gathering. No applause. Just the sound of the city beginning another ordinary morning. A taxi pulled away from the curb. Walter looked back only once. Then he faced forward. Nearly 2 hours later, Rose hurried into headquarters carrying her laptop. She noticed an unusual silence in the transportation office. "Good morning." Nobody answered with their usual enthusiasm. Michael finally looked up. "Morning, Miss Bennett." She frowned. "Is everything all right?" Michael hesitated. "Didn't anyone tell you?" "Tell me what?" "Walter resigned." Rose stood completely still. "What?" "He left this morning." Her laptop slipped from her hand onto the carpet. "No." Michael looked away. "I'm sorry." Rose turned immediately and hurried toward the executive garage. The parking space where Walter usually waited stood empty. No black SUV. No familiar smile. No quiet greeting. Nothing. She searched the lobby, the cafeteria, the staff entrance, everywhere. Each answer was the same. He already left. Rose's heartbeat quickened. There has to be a mistake. There isn't. She remembered the library. Almost instinctively, her feet carried her there. The room remained exactly as always. Books neatly arranged. Morning sunlight filtering through the tall windows. She walked toward her favorite shelf. Her fingers found the worn novel almost automatically. As she pulled it free, a folded letter slipped onto the floor. Rose froze. She recognized the handwriting immediately. "Walter?" With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper. The room faded around her as she read. Line after line, memory after memory. Every sentence felt like hearing his voice one final time. By the time she reached the closing words, tears blurred the page so completely she could barely continue. She pressed the letter against her chest. A quiet sob escaped before she could stop it. "No," her voice broke. "You weren't supposed to leave." She slowly sank into the nearby chair, not because Walter had been a driver, not because he had resigned, but because she had finally realized something she hadn't allowed herself to admit. She hadn't simply trusted him. She had fallen in love with him. Across the Atlantic, hours later, Walter looked out the window of a departing aircraft as the American coastline gradually disappeared beneath the clouds. He whispered only one sentence. "I hope someday you'll understand." The plane continued climbing toward Europe, while two hearts on opposite sides of the ocean carried the same quiet ache, neither knowing that fate had not finished writing their story. 4 months passed. Winter quietly gave way to spring. Life moved forward for everyone, or at least that was what they told themselves. Rose returned to work every morning with the same discipline she had always shown. She attended board meetings, reviewed acquisitions, met with investors, answered endless emails. From the outside, she looked exactly as she had before. Only Lily noticed the difference. Rose laughed less. She stayed later at the office. The novel Walter had left behind never left her desk. Sometimes, during particularly difficult afternoons, she opened the folded letter and read only a few lines before carefully placing it back inside the pages. She never allowed anyone to see it, not even Lily. Malcolm carried his own burden. Although he never admitted it aloud, Walter's resignation had unsettled him. More than once, he found himself replaying their final conversation. The young man had never shouted, never defended himself aggressively, never insulted him. Instead, he had accepted every accusation with remarkable composure. Malcolm couldn't decide whether that made Walter innocent or simply impossible to read. He buried those thoughts beneath work, quarterly reports, expansion plans, international negotiations. Yet every now and then, Walter's calm voice returned to him. "You're trying to protect your daughter." The words echoed differently now. One Monday morning, Malcolm's executive assistant entered carrying a sealed envelope. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett." "Morning." This arrived through diplomatic courier. Malcolm looked up immediately. "Diplomatic?" "Yes. It required your signature." She placed the envelope on his desk. The heavy cream paper carried an embossed royal crest pressed into deep blue wax. Malcolm frowned. He had received invitations from presidents, international trade organizations, European ministries. This crest he didn't recognize. Carefully breaking the seal, he unfolded the letter. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. He read it again. Rose happened to enter at that moment. "Dad?" He didn't answer. She noticed the unusual expression on his face. "What happened?" Malcolm slowly handed her the invitation. Rose read silently. Her eyebrows lifted. "The Royal Council requests the presence of Bennett Global Holdings to finalize an exclusive international strategic partnership." She looked back up. "This is," Malcolm finished quietly, "the largest opportunity this company has ever received." The agreement involved infrastructure, technology, clean energy, and long-term investment across multiple European markets. The projected value exceeded every previous contract Bennett Global had signed. Rose smiled. "This is incredible." Malcolm nodded. "It is." He paused thoughtfully. "They specifically requested our family attend." "Our family?" "Yes." Rose looked surprised. "That's unusual." "It certainly is." That evening, Malcolm called both daughters into his study. Lily arrived first. "So?" She sat down. "What's the emergency?" Rose smiled faintly. "Dad received an invitation." "To what?" Malcolm handed both women copies. Lily scanned the first page. "Europe?" She continued reading. "A royal palace?" She looked up with wide eyes. "We're meeting actual royalty?" Malcolm nodded once. "If negotiations succeed." Lily grinned. "Now this is a business trip." Rose laughed softly. "You'd be excited regardless." "Absolutely." Malcolm watched both daughters carefully. "I'd like both of you to come." Rose looked surprised. "I assumed this would only involve senior executives." "Ordinarily," he nodded. "But the invitation specifically mentions immediate family." Lily clapped once. "I've never been inside a palace." Rose looked toward the window. Perhaps a different country, different surroundings, different responsibilities might finally help her stop thinking about Walter. The thought felt almost impossible, yet she quietly accepted. "I'll go," Malcolm smiled. "Good." Over the following weeks, preparations consumed the entire company. Legal teams reviewed preliminary agreements. Financial advisors coordinated schedules. Security personnel finalized travel arrangements. Everything had to be perfect. The significance of the partnership couldn't be overstated. On the morning of departure, Bennett Global's private aircraft lifted into the clear spring sky. Lily immediately claimed the window seat. "I still can't believe this," Rose smiled. "You've said that 6 times. I'll probably say it 6 more." Malcolm reviewed briefing documents while the sisters talked quietly. Several hours into the flight, Lily looked toward Rose. "You've been awfully quiet." "I'm fine." "No, you've been pretending to be fine." Rose looked down. Lily reached across and gently squeezed her hand. "You still miss him?" Rose didn't answer immediately. Finally, she nodded. "I thought time would make it easier." "Did it?" Rose smiled sadly. "Not really." Lily looked out the window. For reasons she couldn't fully explain, she still carried unanswered questions about Walter herself. Questions she had never shared with anyone. Perhaps this journey would become more than a business trip. Somehow she couldn't shake the feeling that Europe held answers none of them were expecting to find. The Bennett family landed the following afternoon beneath bright European skies. Luxury vehicles bearing royal insignias waited beside the runway. Uniformed officials greeted each arriving guest with flawless courtesy. One senior protocol officer stepped forward. "Mr. Bennett." Malcolm extended his hand. "Thank you for receiving us. The honor is ours." He smiled warmly. "Transportation has been prepared." As the convoy left the airport, Lily pressed her face lightly against the window. Every village, every vineyard, every historic stone bridge fascinated her. Rose admired the scenery quietly. Malcolm continued reviewing partnership notes. Nearly an hour later, the convoy rounded a gentle curve. The palace appeared. Its towers stretched above ancient gardens. Elegant fountains sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Flags bearing the royal crest fluttered above enormous gates. Even Malcolm fell silent. "Remarkable," Rose whispered. "It's beautiful." The vehicles passed through wrought iron gates before stopping beneath an impressive entrance framed by towering marble columns. Rows of palace staff stood waiting. Every movement appeared perfectly coordinated. A dignified gentleman stepped forward. "Welcome. I am Lord Harrington, Lord Chamberlain to their Majesties. We've prepared your accommodations." Malcolm smiled politely. "Thank you." As attendants carried luggage inside, Rose looked around the grand entrance hall. Portraits lined the walls. Generations of monarchs, royal weddings, historic ceremonies. Lily wandered a few steps farther before stopping abruptly. "Rose." Rose turned. "What is it?" Lily pointed toward a large portrait hanging above the sweeping staircase. Rose looked up. Her heart stopped. The young man in the painting looked familiar, very familiar. She slowly walked closer. The portrait showed a handsome young royal dressed in formal military attire. The resemblance. It couldn't be. "No," Rose whispered. Lily stared in disbelief. "He." Before either sister could finish speaking, 2 palace attendants carrying fresh flowers passed nearby. One noticed where they were looking. A warm smile crossed her face. "His Royal Highness has always been everyone's favorite portrait." The other attendant smiled knowingly. "Indeed." The women continued walking. Rose remained frozen. His smile, his eyes, the shape of his face, everything reminded her of Walter. It can't be. Lily looked around the palace again. Then something else caught her attention. Another smaller photograph rested on an ornate side table. The same young royal. Different suit, different setting, exactly the same face. She slowly looked toward Rose. Neither spoke. Across the hall, several palace employees exchanged discreet smiles after noticing the Bennett family's reactions. Not mocking smiles, knowing smiles, almost as though they had been waiting for this exact moment. Neither Rose nor Lily could take their eyes off the portrait. It wasn't simply a resemblance. It was Walter, the same calm expression, the same thoughtful eyes. The same quiet smile that had greeted employees every morning at Bennett Global. Only now he wore an immaculate ceremonial uniform, adorned with medals and a royal sash. Lily laughed nervously. No, Rose slowly shook her head. There has to be another explanation. Before either sister could speak again, Lord Harrington approached them. I hope your accommodations are comfortable. Malcolm nodded. They're exceptional. Rose glanced toward the portrait. May I ask? Lord Harrington followed her gaze. Of course. The prince in that portrait. She struggled to keep her voice steady. What is his name? The elderly gentleman smiled warmly. His Royal Highness, Crown Prince Walter Alexander. Time seemed to stop. Rose felt the colour drain from her face. Lily instinctively reached for the staircase railing. Malcolm stared at the portrait again. Walter? The name struck him like a distant echo. Walter, his driver. Walter, his employee. Walter, the young man he had accused of chasing the Bennett fortune. No, that wasn't possible. He forced a polite smile. An extraordinary coincidence. Lord Harrington looked puzzled. I'm sorry. My former employee shares the same first name. The Chamberlain smiled. It is a fine name. He excused himself to greet another arriving delegation. The Bennett family remained exactly where they stood. None of them moved. None of them spoke. Later that afternoon, palace attendants escorted international guests through a private historical gallery before the official reception. The gallery displayed centuries of royal history, ancient treaties, family portraits, state visits, military ceremonies. Rose wandered almost absent-mindedly through the exhibition. Then she stopped again. Inside a glass display rested several photographs taken over recent years. Charity events, hospital visits, educational programs, environmental projects. Each image featured the same young prince, Walter, only not the Walter she had known. Here, crowds gathered around him. Children hugged him. World leaders shook his hand. Military officers saluted as he passed. Rose felt her breathing become uneven. She remembered him kneeling on the lobby floor, helping the receptionist gather scattered documents. She remembered him carrying grocery bags for elderly neighbors after work. She remembered him laughing about burning pasta in his tiny apartment. How could those memories belong to the same man? Lily slowly stepped beside her. I heard him. Rose looked over. What? Lily swallowed. Months ago. He was speaking on the phone. I couldn't understand the language. But he kept saying. She hesitated. His Majesty. Her Majesty. Rose stared at her. You never told me. I thought I was imagining it. I tried looking into his past. I couldn't find anything. Rose looked back toward the photographs. Suddenly, everything made sense. The protected records, the missing information, the impossible confidence, the languages, the diplomacy, the grace with which he handled every difficult situation. Walter had never been pretending to be extraordinary. He had spent every day pretending to be ordinary. Across the gallery, Malcolm stood alone. His attention settled on a framed newspaper clipping. It showed the Crown Prince addressing an international economic summit. The accompanying article praised his understanding of global finance. Malcolm quietly closed his eyes. A memory returned immediately. Walter standing beside the presentation screen, explaining the misunderstanding during the international negotiations. He hadn't been guessing. He hadn't been lucky. He had spent his entire life preparing for conversations exactly like that. Another memory followed. You're trying to protect your daughter. Then another. I wouldn't ask you to apologize. Another. I gave my word. Malcolm slowly lowered his head. Every accusation he had made, every conclusion, every suspicion, collapsed beneath one unbearable realization. Walter had possessed wealth beyond imagination, power beyond Malcolm's reach, influence no corporate empire could rival. There had never been a single reason for him to pursue the Bennet fortune. Not one. For the first time in many years, Malcolm Bennet questioned his own judgment. An announcement echoed through the palace. "Ladies and gentlemen, the official reception will begin in 10 minutes. Guests gradually made their way toward the magnificent state ballroom. Rose walked silently. Lily remained beside her. Neither sister spoke. Each carried the same question. Would they actually see him? And if they did, would he even want to see them? Well, some truths answered old questions only to create far more difficult ones. The royal ballroom surpassed every expectation. Crystal chandeliers illuminated soaring ceilings painted with centuries-old masterpieces. An orchestra performed quietly from an elevated gallery. Representatives from governments, multinational corporations, charitable organizations, and royal households filled the room. Palace attendants moved with practiced precision. Everything reflected order. Everything reflected tradition. The Bennet family took their assigned places among the invited guests. Rose barely noticed the conversation surrounding her. Her eyes constantly searched the room. Lily did the same. Malcolm remained unusually quiet, without warning. The ceremonial staff struck the marble floor 3 times. The orchestra stopped. Every conversation ended instantly. A commanding voice echoed throughout the ballroom. "Their Majesties, the King and Queen." Every guest rose to their feet. The enormous doors opened. The King entered beside the Queen. Both acknowledged the assembled guests with warm dignity before moving toward the front of the hall. The King welcomed everyone, spoke briefly about international cooperation, then smiled. "This evening," he said calmly, "our family has the privilege of introducing someone many of you already know." Rose's heartbeat accelerated. The King continued, "My son has recently completed a personal journey that has changed him profoundly." He looked toward the entrance. The room became perfectly silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present." The doors opened once more. Walter entered. He wore formal royal attire, tailored with understated elegance. A blue ceremonial sash crossed his chest. Royal decorations rested neatly against his jacket. His posture remained calm, his expression composed. Yet beneath the formal appearance, Rose immediately recognized the same gentleman who had once left sandwiches outside her office. Every palace servant lowered their heads respectfully. Military officers standing along the walls raised their hands in salute. Diplomats rose without hesitation. Foreign dignitaries applauded politely. Walter acknowledged them with quiet humility before approaching the King. Malcolm couldn't breathe. Lily covered her mouth. Rose's eyes filled with tears. The King rested one proud hand on Walter's shoulder. His voice carried clearly through the magnificent hall. "Allow me to introduce my beloved son, His Royal Highness, Crown Prince Walter Alexander, heir to our throne." Silence. Complete, absolute silence. No member of the Bennet family could find a single word. Everything they believed they knew about Walter had changed in one breathtaking moment. The applause slowly faded throughout the magnificent ballroom. Conversations resumed. Crystal glasses clinked gently. The orchestra began another elegant melody. Diplomats greeted one another with polite smiles, while royal officials escorted guests toward the reception hall. Yet Malcolm Bennet remained completely still. Everything around him had become distant. His eyes never left Walter. Only minutes earlier, he had watched palace servants bow before the same young man who had once quietly polished company vehicles before sunrise. Military officers had saluted him. Foreign ambassadors had waited patiently to greet him. The King himself had proudly placed a hand on his shoulder and called him "my son." Malcolm lowered his eyes. His chest felt unusually heavy. Memory after memory came rushing back. Walter carrying heavy boxes without being asked. Walter helping the receptionist gather papers scattered across the lobby floor. Walter staying late outside headquarters simply because Rose was still working. Walter accepting harsh words without ever raising his voice. Then another memory returned. The only conclusion that makes sense is that you've deliberately manipulated your way into my family's life. Malcolm heard his own voice repeating the accusation. Each word now felt unbearable. He quietly whispered, "I was wrong." Rose heard him. She slowly turned toward her father. He wasn't looking at Walter with suspicion anymore. There was only regret. Deep, unmistakable regret. Rose gently touched his arm. "Dad." Malcolm looked at her. "I spent my whole life believing I could judge character." His voice had lost the certainty it usually carried. "I built companies by reading people. I trusted my instincts." He let out a slow breath, and this time his eyes became moist. "I completely failed." Rose squeezed his arm reassuringly. "You were trying to protect us." "I know, but protecting someone should never mean refusing to see who they truly are." He looked toward the doorway, where Walter had disappeared with members of the royal family. "I judged his position. I ignored his actions. And that's the greatest mistake I've made in years." Rose smiled sadly. "You know what I kept telling you?" Malcolm nodded. "You said his actions mattered more than his past." "I did. And you were right." He looked down at his hands. "I accused the only man who never wanted anything from me." The realization settled over him with crushing weight. Walter had never asked for money, never requested influence, never sought promotions, never attempted to impress anyone. He had simply worked, quietly, faithfully, honorably. Malcolm closed his eyes for a brief moment. Perhaps true character wasn't revealed by wealth, education, or social standing. Perhaps it revealed itself through ordinary choices repeated every single day. Several minutes later, a palace attendant approached respectfully. "Mr. Bennet?" Malcolm looked up. "Yes?" "His Royal Highness would be honored if you and your family would join him privately." Malcolm hesitated. "What if he doesn't wish to see me?" The attendant smiled warmly. "His Royal Highness specifically requested that all three of you come." Rose looked at her father. "I think you should go." Malcolm slowly nodded. "I owe him that much." Together the Bennet family followed the attendant through a quiet corridor overlooking the royal gardens. No one spoke. Each carried different emotions. Rose carried hope. Lily carried unanswered questions. Malcolm carried guilt. The attendant stopped outside a beautifully furnished drawing room. He opened the door. Walter stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the gardens. He had removed several ceremonial medals, making him appear less like a prince and more like the man they had known in America. As soon as he saw them enter, he smiled. The same gentle smile. Nothing about it had changed. Walter stepped away from the window. "Thank you for coming." His voice sounded exactly as Rose remembered. Warm, calm, comforting. For a brief moment, nobody answered. Walter motioned toward the seating area. "Please." Everyone quietly took a seat. The fire crackled softly inside the marble fireplace. Outside, evening sunlight settled over the palace gardens. Walter folded his hands together. "I imagine all of you deserve an explanation." Malcolm immediately shook his head. "No." Walter looked surprised. "I owe you one." Malcolm slowly stood. "I've spent months demanding answers from you. I interrupted you. I questioned your motives. I assumed the worst." He swallowed hard. "I don't think I have the right to demand anything anymore." Walter looked at him for several seconds before speaking. "You were protecting your family. I accused you. You believed you had a reason." Malcolm lowered his head. It wasn't enough. Walter gently invited him to sit again. "We can speak honestly now." Malcolm nodded. "I'd appreciate that." Walter looked around the room before beginning. "I was born into extraordinary privilege. My education, my opportunities, my responsibilities. I've never denied any of those blessings. He paused. But I also discovered something very early. Rose listened without looking away. Walter continued. People changed the moment they learned who I was. Children at school became nervous. Parents encouraged friendships for reasons that had nothing to do with me. As I grew older, business leaders introduced their daughters. Political advisors discussed marriage. Every relationship seemed to begin with my title instead of my name. He smiled sadly. Eventually, I stopped asking whether people respected me. I started asking whether they had ever met me at all. The room remained completely silent. Walter looked toward Rose. After another arranged engagement ended, I asked my parents for permission to leave. They thought I wanted rest. What I really wanted, he smiled softly, was an ordinary life. I wanted to rent a small apartment. I wanted to burn dinner while learning to cook. Lily couldn't help smiling through the emotion. Walter smiled back. Yes, the pasta really was terrible. That small moment eased the tension just enough. Then Walter continued. I wanted to stand in line at grocery stores. I wanted to look for work. I wanted people to judge me by my effort, not my family. Rose whispered, So you chose Bennett Global? Walter nodded. I chose a life where nobody expected greatness from me. I wanted to know, his voice became quieter, whether someone could genuinely care about Walter before ever meeting the Crown Prince. Rose slowly stood. Tears filled her eyes. So, she smiled gently. The rainy evening, the books, the tea, the conversations after work, they were all real. Walter answered without the slightest hesitation. Every single one. The sandwich I left on your desk. The letter inside your favorite novel. The afternoons beneath the maple trees. The laughter during traffic. I never pretended during any of those moments. The only thing I hid was the life waiting for me back here. Rose's tears finally escaped. I knew it. Walter looked at her. You did? My heart refused to believe someone capable of so much kindness could have been pretending. Walter's expression softened. He took one careful step closer. Thank you. His voice almost broke. For seeing Walter. Not the title, not the palace, not the future king, just Walter. Rose smiled through tears. And that's still the man I see. For the first time since leaving America, Walter felt the loneliness he had carried for so many years begin to disappear. Silence settled gently over the drawing room. No one felt the need to fill it. For the first time since arriving at the palace, every hidden question finally had an answer. Walter looked toward Lily. She hadn't spoken since Rose's last words. Instead, she stood quietly near the fireplace, staring into the dancing flames. Walter noticed. Lily? She slowly turned. For the first time since they had met months earlier, the cheerful smile that usually brightened her face was missing. I owe you an apology. Walter shook his head gently. You don't. I do. She drew a slow breath before continuing. When you first joined our company, I thought you were mysterious. Walter smiled faintly. I suppose I was. She laughed softly. More mysterious than you realize. The laughter quickly disappeared. I kept trying to figure you out. I asked too many questions. I looked into your background. Walter remained quiet. I even overheard that phone call. Rose looked toward her sister. The one where you mentioned His Majesty. Lily nodded. I never told anyone. I convinced myself I was protecting Rose. She lowered her eyes. But if I'm honest, my curiosity became an obsession. Walter walked a little closer. You were trying to understand. I was. But instead of trusting what I already knew, She looked directly at him. I kept searching for something bigger. Her voice trembled. And the whole time, the truth was standing right in front of me. Walter waited patiently. Lily smiled sadly. You were always kind. You were always respectful. You never treated anyone differently. You made people feel important. She shook her head. I should have trusted those things. Instead, I let unanswered questions become louder than your actions. Walter answered gently. I don't blame you, but I blame myself. You shouldn't. I judged you too. Walter looked surprised. I assumed you were hiding something terrible. She smiled through gathering tears. When all you were hiding was the burden of being born into a life nobody could imagine. Walter's expression softened. I never wanted either of you to carry that burden. I know. Lily laughed quietly. And here I was, trying to make you come to my birthday dinner. Walter smiled. I remember. You kept saying no. I thought it was because you didn't like me. Walter chuckled. I was afraid your father might dismiss me before dessert. For the first time, in what felt like forever, everyone laughed together. The sound filled the room naturally, not forced, not awkward, just honest. When the laughter faded, Lily stepped forward, without saying another word. She hugged Walter. I'm sorry. Walter gently returned the embrace. So am I, for keeping such a difficult secret. She shook her head. No, I'm sorry for believing there had to be something wrong with you. Walter smiled warmly. Thank you. Lily stepped back and looked toward Rose. Their eyes met. No rivalry remained. No jealousy. No resentment. Only relief. She walked over and embraced her sister. I think. She laughed softly. I always knew the two of you belonged together. Rose smiled through tears. You knew? I just refused to admit it. Rose gently wiped away another tear. I never wanted to hurt you. You never did. Lily squeezed her hand. You loved the same man I admired. There's a difference. She smiled. And I'm very glad I have my sister. The two women remained standing together while Walter quietly watched. His greatest fear had always been that revealing the truth would destroy the relationships he had built. Instead, those relationships had become stronger. Perhaps genuine love never demanded perfection. It simply needed honesty to find its way back. The room became quiet once again. This time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. Malcolm slowly stood from his chair. No one interrupted him. He walked toward Walter until only a few feet separated them. For several seconds, he searched for words. The successful businessman who had negotiated billion-dollar contracts throughout his career suddenly found himself unable to form a single sentence. Finally, he spoke. Walter, I'm ashamed. Walter remained silent. I've replayed our final conversation more times than I can count. I remembered every accusation, every assumption, every harsh word. He lowered his eyes. And I realized something. Walter waited patiently. I believed I was judging your character. A sad smile crossed Malcolm's face. In reality, I was judging your occupation. I saw a driver. I saw an assistant. I saw someone whose background I couldn't understand. He looked directly into Walter's eyes. I never truly saw the man. Walter answered quietly. You were protecting your family. Malcolm shook his head. No, I hid behind that excuse. I let fear become prejudice. I measured your value using the wrong standards. He paused. Not because you are a prince. Walter looked at him carefully. Malcolm continued. If you had truly been only my driver, my apology would still be exactly the same. Rose smiled quietly. Lily nodded in agreement. Malcolm's voice grew steadier. I've spent years teaching my daughters that character matters. And somehow, I became the one who forgot that lesson. He slowly extended his hand. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that, but I'm asking anyway. Walter looked at the outstretched hand. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Walter smiled. The same gentle smile Malcolm had seen on the very first morning outside Bennett Global. He reached forward. Instead of merely shaking Malcolm's hand, he placed his other hand over it. I forgave you the day I left America. Malcolm looked stunned. You did? Walter nodded. I understood why you acted the way you did. I never stopped respecting a father who loved his daughters enough to protect them. Malcolm's eyes filled with emotion. I don't know what to say. Walter smiled. You've already said enough. Without another word, Malcolm stepped forward and embraced him. Not the crown prince, not the future king, simply Walter. When they separated, the king and queen, who had quietly entered the room moments earlier without interrupting, exchanged warm smiles. The king spoke gently. This, he looked at everyone gathered together, is precisely the lesson my son hoped to find. The queen nodded. A title may open doors, but only character opens hearts. No one disagreed. Outside, the evening sun settled over the palace gardens, bathing the ancient stone walls in golden light. Inside that quiet room, misunderstanding had become understanding. Judgment had become humility, and forgiveness had become the bridge that reunited people who, only days earlier, believed they had lost one another forever. Nearly 6 months had passed since the evening the Bennett family discovered the truth. The palace no longer felt unfamiliar to Rose. The grand hallways that had once intimidated her now carried warm memories instead. She knew which balcony Walter escaped to whenever he needed a quiet moment. She knew which garden his mother loved to walk through each morning. She even knew which palace chef secretly prepared Walter's favourite apple pastries whenever he returned from official duties. The palace had become home, not because of its beauty, because Walter was there. Early one spring morning, sunlight poured through the windows of the palace's private breakfast room. Walter entered carrying several invitation samples. Rose looked up from her tea. You've been in meetings already? He smiled. Since 6, she laughed. I thought princes had easier mornings. Walter pulled out the chair beside her. I've been trying to convince people that weddings don't require 500 meetings. And I've lost every argument. Rose laughed again. I suspected as much. He kissed her forehead before sitting beside her. The Queen entered moments later. I heard laughter. Walter smiled. Rose thinks I have no influence over wedding planning. The Queen laughed knowingly. She's absolutely correct. Walter looked dramatically disappointed. I see neither of you intends to support me. Oh, we support you, the Queen smiled. We simply don't expect miracles. Even Walter laughed. The warmth between them reminded Rose why she had fallen in love with this family. There was tradition, there was dignity. Yet beneath every royal custom lived genuine affection. A short while later, the palace's wedding planning committee assembled inside a historic council room. Designers presented floral arrangements. Musicians discussed ceremonial pieces. Royal advisers reviewed centuries-old traditions. Walter listened patiently, then raised one hand. I'd like to request one change. The room became quiet. The chief protocol officer nodded. Your Royal Highness. Walter looked around the table. I've reviewed the guest list. So have we. I believe it's incomplete. The advisers exchanged puzzled glances. In what way? Walter opened a folder. I'd like to add more names. The chief adviser smiled politely. Certainly. Which royal households? Walter shook his head. Not royal households. The room fell silent. Walter continued. I'd like invitations prepared for Michael Carter. The Queen smiled immediately. Rose's face brightened. Walter continued reading. The receptionists, the cafeteria staff, the maintenance team, the security guards, the transportation department, the housekeepers, the accounting assistant whose papers I helped collect. Every name brought another surprised expression around the room. One advisor finally spoke. Your Royal Highness, these individuals are not members of government. I know. They're not aristocrats. I know. They're ordinary employees. Walter smiled gently. So was I. Nobody answered. Walter continued. When I arrived in America, nobody knew who I really was. They respected me because they believed I deserved respect. They invited me to lunch. They asked whether I'd eaten. They celebrated my birthday. They treated me kindly, without expecting anything. He looked around the room. If this wedding celebrates love, it should also celebrate gratitude. Rose quietly reached for his hand beneath the table. The king watched his son with unmistakable pride. Finally, the Queen spoke. I think that's a beautiful idea. The king nodded. So do I. One by one, every advisor agreed. The chief protocol officer smiled. It will certainly be the first royal wedding in our history, where drivers and kings sit beneath the same roof. Walter answered softly. Exactly. Later that afternoon, Rose and Walter walked through the palace gardens where the ceremony would take place. Workers carefully prepared flower beds. Musicians rehearsed nearby. Rows of white chairs stretched beneath ancient oak trees. Rose looked around quietly. It still doesn't feel real. Walter smiled. What part? She laughed. Any of it. The palace. The wedding. The fact that you're actually a prince. Walter stopped walking. He turned toward her. I need to ask you something. She looked up. What is it? If you had discovered the truth the first day we met. Rose smiled before he even finished. I would have been terrified. Walter laughed. I remember. She stepped closer. I would have seen the title, not the man. Walter gently brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, just as he had during their engagement celebration months earlier. And now? Rose looked directly into his eyes. Now, she smiled. I can't imagine separating the two. The prince earned my respect, but Walter... She rested her hand against his chest. Earned my heart. Walter leaned forward until their foreheads touched. Neither of them hurried to speak. The gentle breeze carried the scent of spring flowers through the gardens. Somewhere in the distance, the palace orchestra rehearsed the melody that would soon accompany them down the aisle. Walter whispered softly, You know... What? I crossed an ocean, searching for an ordinary life. Rose smiled. And what did you find? He looked into her eyes. The most extraordinary woman I've ever known. Rose laughed through happy tears. I think. She squeezed his hand. You finally found exactly what you were looking for. Walter nodded. I did. Together they continued walking through the gardens where, in only a few short days, two worlds would become one. Not because of crowns or fortunes, but because of two hearts that had first learned to love each other in the simplest moments of ordinary life.
If you enjoy American Love Stories, please consider subscribing and comment what you need next. And love you all from Mr. Osteen.